My name is Ethan Langford. I was 28 years old on June 14th, 2019, a dry, sticky evening in Grand Rapids that smelled faintly of river mud and cut grass. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't particularly brave. I worked the night shift at a small printing press on Leonard Street. I liked old jazz records, and I had a stubborn belief that if you learned to fix the thing yourself, it would look after you. That night changed everything I thought I understood about being careful. You should know the sort of life I had, because part of why the things that happened to me feel so wrong is that they intruded on a life that was ordinary in the most stubborn way. I lived in a brick row house a few blocks from the Grand River, a ground floor apartment above a florist, where every morning my windows opened onto spilled light and the taste of cut lilies. My neighbor across the hall, Marla Winslow, ran a small bakery and could make you feel less lonely with a single cinnamon roll and an exacting eye. My best friend, Gavin Brooks, owned a used bookstore downtown called Northlight Books. He'd given me a secondhand copy of Faulkner the winter I moved in, and we traded workday complaints over coffee like small, sacred rituals. Work at the press was the kind that settled a person into routines: run the proofs, feed the guillotine, stack the signatures. The nights smelled of ink and solvents and the steady hum of machinery. There were quiet hours where the world narrowed down to the light on a page. It was late June, and we'd been running a rush job of municipal pamphlets, the kind nobody reads until they have to, and I was the last man packing outbound pallets. I liked the solitude, the way the building felt like a belly of a sleeping animal, safe, predictable, lit by sodium lamps. But life in Grand Rapids is also a city of edges. The river cuts a long spine through neighborhoods of tidy porches and boarded factories. On its banks, the old mills still creak. Beneath bridges, the current carries secrets downstream. People who've lived here long enough learn where the light doesn't reach at night, which streets lose cell reception, and which alleys smell of motor oil and cold warning. I'd learned those things the usual way, by walking late shifts home, by learning which streets were shortcuts and which felt long in the dark. There were signs, small and stupid, that I should have noticed. The first was the way my landlord's dog, an old black lab named Mabel, stopped wagging if I came home after midnight. She'd lift her head, look at me like a weather vane, and go back to sleep. The second was a man I saw 3 nights in a row, leaning against the wall of the Calder Library. A hat pulled low, a paper bag at his feet, watching people pass with an interest that felt like a measurement. He never moved when I walked by and never spoke. Grand Rapids had its share of eccentric loners. I told myself that was all it was. Character matters in a story, and I want you to meet the people who mattered to me. Marla, who smelled of sugar and rosemary and thought everyone deserved a second chance. Gavin, who never let a stray dog pass a bookstore door without shelter. An elderly couple, the Rutledges, who ran the hardware store and gave me advice as if I were their son. There was also my sister, Claire, living an hour away in Kalamazoo, who called me every Sunday to argue about trivialities like why the Browns would never win and whether the lake trout were worth the price. They felt like steadily held things in a life that otherwise bounced between ordinary routine and the little manageable disappointments of an adult existence. A week before June 14th, I had a strange little success. I fixed the press's misaligned plate by hand, the way my father had once taught me to work on the old Chevy in his garage. It was greasy and precise, and it worked. Gavin bought me a beer, and Marla sent over a box of pastries. Pride is a small, combustible thing. It makes you walk taller, and it makes you assume the world is a little kinder than it is. On the night of the incident, I closed at 11:30 p.m. The press had a habit of running late. The client wanted everything on pallets, and the foreman wanted them neat. I said goodnight, locked the back door, and walked out under the sodium lamps toward Leonard Street. The river was dark but audible, low water and the sound of a barge somewhere downstream. There were fewer people at that hour, and the city seemed to have folded itself down. I remember thinking, with a kind of cheap optimism, that it would be a nice night for walking. The weather was warm but not oppressive, the sky an ink wash, and even the usual late-night drunks were absent. I took my usual route, down by Riverside Drive, where the mills throw the long shadows, and then up through a narrow residential lane that cuts behind the bakery and the florist. It shaves 5 minutes off the walk and carries the advantage of being well lit, or at least it usually was. Halfway down the lane, though, a single street lamp had blown out. The bulb sagged from its socket like a missing tooth. I suppose most people would have crossed to the other side of the street or kept walking with a brisker step. But habit and stubbornness are twin sins in men who work night shifts. I kept going. That's when I heard the first sound that didn't fit the city's grammar. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like a pair of knuckles dancing against brick. It wasn't the steady, mechanical echo of a train or the distant rattle of a bus. It was too close, and it had a cadence to it. 2 taps, a pause, 3 taps. I stopped, because a human has to check a strange sound at midnight in a city that eats the inattentive. I told myself it was a loose shutter or someone fixing a lock. The lane smelled of pansies and oil, the night air cool around my neck. I checked my phone, 30% battery, no missed calls. Another 2 taps. From my right, somewhere near the back door of an old warehouse, a shadow moved. Not a person exactly. At least at first glance, it seemed to be the suggestion of a person, an absence that was shaped like a human. The shape moved across the wall in a slow, cautious way, like someone easing past a sleeping dog. My pulse tightened. I told myself to keep walking. I told myself it was nothing. But the tapping continued, and then, unmistakably, a voice said my name. Ethan. It was soft, almost reverent, and it came from where the shadow had bent, where the bricks met the alley. I should have turned and kept going. I should have shouted for help. Instead, I answered like any foolish man does when surprised by the sound of his name at midnight. Who's there? Silence. Then the tapping resumed. 2 beats. Pause. 3. The kind of silence that follows a whisper in a dark place is not empty. It is full of possibility. I took 2 steps forward, and everything I thought I knew about the lane shifted. The smell of the lilies vanished. The air felt thicker. My eyes took in shapes and stretched them into threats. I had the main story sitting on the edge of my tongue, ready to leap in, and it starts now. The voice said my name again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It came from the mouth of a man who sounded like he'd swallowed gravel. It carried familiarity and a little humor, and behind it, something else, like an undertow. Ethan, he said. You left your light on. The tapping turned into a slow metallic scrape, like a key being dragged along a fence. I stepped closer, heart thumping, and in the dim I could make out 2 figures. One leaned against the warehouse wall, the other, taller, impossibly thin, stood a few paces behind, its face a pocket of shadow. The nearer man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He held out a folded flyer, the municipal pamphlet we'd printed that week, and the edges were damp. Thought you might want this, he said. It should have been a simple exchange. A man with a flyer, a passerby that absorbed the transaction like it did so many others. But the taller thing didn't blink. The 2 taps of the tapping had become a pattern, and patterns in the dark make people see things they shouldn't. I reached for the flyer because that's what you do when someone offers a paper. You reach, you take, you fold it into your pocket. As my fingers touched the damp paper, the taller figure moved in a way that wasn't right for a human joint. It leaned, not toward me, but toward the sound of the river and everything behind it. The small sheds, the rusting bicycles, the gash of shadow, answered with something that felt like patience. The nearer man's smile broadened as if to show me he knew nothing was amiss. You live close by, he asked. I should have said no. I should have run. But from somewhere deeper than sense, from the bone level of habit, I answered like a man answering a question he'd heard 100 times. Just down the block. His eyes glinted in the lamplight. Small world, he said. Then the taller figure's head tilted, and it was like the lane had swallowed air. The tapping stopped. The night held its breath. And then, somewhere beyond the smell of lilies, something moved in a way that made the world tilt. I felt it then. The first real prickling of that old ancestral warning people talk about when the world goes wrong. The hair along my arms rose, and the street lamp seemed to dim a degree I couldn't account for. The nearer man's breath clouded slightly, though the air was warm, and his smile hardened into something with a memory in it. He stepped closer. You always walk this way? He said. I didn't have an answer that wasn't a lie. My tongue felt heavy. Behind him, the taller figure's arm, too long, too folded at the elbow, brushed the brick in a way that made the mortar sing. I was learning then that some evenings keep their worst surprises slow, so you can watch the small acts that lead to them. I was, at 28 on June 14th, about to be taught a lesson I would never unlearn. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I remember the exact way my chest felt when the world narrowed to two people in one impossible shape. Tight, knotted, like holding your breath under cold water. The nearer man didn't reach for me in the ordinary way. He slid forward as if he'd rehearsed the move 1,000 times in his head. His hand closed on my wrist. Not hard, but with a pressure that suggested he could make it hard if he wanted, and his fingers were dry as old paper. "Easy," he said, with the same half-joking softness he'd used before. The taller thing behind him shifted, and the sound it made was not flesh, but something like fabric dragged slow over glass. I could feel the night pressing on every side, the bricks sweating, the alleyways holding their breath. I tried to pull my wrist away. My hands smelled of ink and oil, the residue from the press, but the man's grip ignored that. "You shouldn't be walking alone," he murmured. His eyes, a watery, ordinary blue, had a lack of punctuation in them, like quotation marks that never quite closed. "Aren't you afraid, Ethan?" There are small cruelties people use to move others: familiarity, flattery, threat. He used familiarity, which is worse because it makes you answer. "No," I said, and it came out like a wish. He tilted his head toward the taller figure. "He likes that," he said. "He likes telling stories about people who think they aren't afraid." The tall thing made a slow step sideways so that I could see it more clearly. It wasn't that it had no face. It had too many faces, like a collage of expressions in the wrong places. Where eyes should have been, there were pale hollows, and where a mouth might be was a seam of thin gray skin that moved without sound. Its limbs bent in angles I'd never seen on a person, elbows folding the wrong way as if they were edited into the wrong paragraph. Every movement it made created a whispering draft along the alley bricks. I say now that something inside me went small and fierce. I don't know whether that's true or whether memory has made the story prettier so it could be told. What I do know is that instinct is older than sense. I planted my feet and jerked my arm free. The man's face flickered with something. Surprise, disappointment, and he laughed softly like someone reading a joke only he understands. "Run," I told myself, and it sounded like a command from a man in a film. My legs obeyed like a child's. I don't know exactly when the taller thing decided to move. One second it was an observer wrapped in shadow. The next, it was stepping in a gait that matched neither the human rhythm nor the mechanical tempo. It glided, and the space between us collapsed. There was no siren, no sudden hero with a flashlight. There was only the press of night, the scrape of shoes on concrete, and the river humming like a thing that knew everything. I ran toward Leonard like a dog to its bowl. Behind me, I heard the man's laughter, then a different sound, 2 sharp taps, pause, 3 quick strikes, and it followed me, not from the alley but from inside my skull, as if the tapping had been tucked into my ears. Phones are a weak comfort on nights like that. Mine vibrated in my pocket with an incoming text from Gavin. "We closed early? You good?" I thumbed an answer, fingers clumsy, and the keys felt sticky with sweat. Before I could hit send, the screen blacked out. No service. I tried again. The screen offered only the stale comfort of a battery percentage, and then darkness. My heart kept time with my feet. I took side streets I knew by habit, a map of small kindnesses and shortcuts, but the city felt stranger, as if I'd woken in the wrong draft of a familiar story. I made it as far as Marla's bakery and found the roll-down metal door scraped halfway down. A smear of frosting on the pavement looked like a fossil. I banged on the metal with my shoulder until my shoulder hurt, and inside someone, a sleepy presence, muttered, but did not come. The smell of sugar punched through the night's dust and felt like a hand on my collar. "Please," I said into the metal. My voice sounded small and ridiculous in the space between the buildings. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then went silent. I kept moving. The Rutledge's hardware was dark, its faded sign folded into the night's moth-eaten throat. Northlight Books was a dark rectangle of glass. The city had locked itself in like a clam. My shoes hit the pavement, and I thought of my father's garage, the smell of grease and spilled beer, the long, small patience it took to fix something properly. I wanted that now, something to fix, anything that could be restored to the way it should be. When I reached my own building, my breath went shallow. The stoop was wet, though it hadn't rained. There were footprints on the concrete that weren't mine, little half-moons of damp leading to my door. Mabel, the landlord's lab, was awake. Ears pricked at the window, but when I pressed the bell, she didn't bark. The apartment door stuck briefly as if someone had leaned on it from the other side and then released it. Inside, the place smelled wrong. Not like lilies or pastry, but like a box of old photographs left in a basement. Dry, papery, metallic at the edges. My light switch worked. The living room lamp blazed like a lighthouse. I set my keys on the mantel and felt for the flyer in my pocket. My fingers closed around paper that wasn't the municipal pamphlet I'd reached for in the alley. It was a folded scrap, damp at the corner, and when I opened it, the ink made my skin cold. There, in a handwriting that looked like scratches made by a fingernail, was one sentence: "We watched you." Under it, a smaller line had been pressed so hard it had dented the paper: "Don't sleep." My phone buzzed once, then died. Mabel's growl sounded from the hallway, low, uncertain, and when I pulled the curtain aside to look out the back window, the alley was empty, a cleared place of bricks and rubbish and the ghost of footprints. But the street lamp that had been blown out earlier flickered and then burned steady, as if someone had returned a light. From the sidewalk below, a shadow moved once, too long for a man, and then stilled. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with the flyer on my knee and the television on mute for company. I thought about calling the police, and I thought about calling Gavin, and both plans collapsed into the same dull realization. Adults make phone calls to solve problems. Sometimes problems don't answer. Every little sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the far clatter of a car, grew into a punctuation mark. Twice I opened the front door to check the stoop. Twice I found nothing but the lingering damp of other people's passages. At 3:07 a.m., as I was trying to convince myself the worst of it had been standing in an alley and running home, I heard it again. The tapping. It started at the exact tempo it had the first night. 2 taps, pause, 3. This time it came from the back window, from the narrow alley that split the blocks behind my building. I moved toward the sound like someone being led by a bell. The curtain trembled against my fingertips. On the glass at eye level, 2 small smudges marked the window, like eyes pressed into fog. When I leaned closer, I could see the imprint of something that had been there and then withdrawn, a smear like a mouth pressed against the pane. The flyer on my knee stiffened at the edges, and the words on it looked freshly written, as if the ink had smoldered and cooled. I backed away and nearly knocked over the lamp. The room swam. My hands, the same hands that had fixed a misaligned press plate and earned a box of pastries and a beer, felt like they belonged to someone else. The thing I had run from had followed me home, or the night had swallowed a detail and regurgitated it with interest. I thought of Marla asleep above her ovens, of Gavin behind his stacks of dog-eared novels, of the Rutledges in a world of screws and nails. None of them had offered a solution. None of them had yet been asked. I opened the window an inch. The cool night air smelled of river and rain that hadn't fallen yet. The 2 taps sounded again, slower now, as if someone were taking care in their performance. I thought of the taller figure tilting its head, of that smile that didn't reach the eyes, and of the voice that had told me I left my light on like a blessing. From somewhere close, as if from the marrow of the city, a new sound threaded through the tapping. Something aligned with logic, but not with comfort. A voice, not more than a whisper, saying my name in a cadence that fit the rhythm of the knocks. Ethan. I did what a cornered animal does. I reached for the phone, for anything. The battery icon blinked once and died. The tapping resumed, patient as a metronome. I sat down hard, legs trembling, and for the first time since I was a kid in my father's garage with a wrench in my hand, I felt completely and helplessly out of my depth. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I didn't sleep. Dawn came in slow as guilt and left the living room smelling of coffee and pages I had forgotten to read. I called the police at 9, hands shaking so much the dispatcher asked if I needed an ambulance. I told them about the flyer, the tapping, the man with the damp pamphlet, and the thing behind him. She took notes in a voice trained to keep people calm. A patrol car came, two young officers with polite shoes and practiced skepticism. They walked the alley, shone a flashlight up at the blown lamp, now inexplicably fixed, checked the stoop, asked me questions in a rote that felt like a test. They wrote down the line from the flyer. "We watched you. Don't sleep." They found the indent on the paper where someone had pressed hard. Their radios sang in bursts. "No prints," one said, and the other added, "No cameras see anything." That was the first time I noticed how the city could shrug its shoulders at you when you asked for help. "We'll keep an eye on the area," one promised. It was the sort of promise you give a neighbor about a noisy dog. Gavin came over in the afternoon like a bucket of practical light. He'd stayed up in his shop until the last customer left, then locked the door and caught the bus. He refused to believe the supernatural explanation. Gavin believed in dog-eared facts and the odor of old books rather than omens. "Let's think like detectives," he said, and he meant it. He suggested we document, set up cameras, get witnesses. Marla put out trays of pastries and refused to talk about what she'd seen as anything but bad luck. The Rutledges showed up with a pair of industrial flashlights and a crate of old tools, as if a hardware store's generosity could fix fear. We started with small things. Gavin wired a cheap motion camera to his laptop and left it by the back window. The Rutledges lent a spotlight they used for winter signs, the kind that could blind a man at 5 yards. We taped the flyer to the wall opposite my window and sat like captors of a fragile, absurd hope that whatever was visiting would be interested enough to show itself again. Night returned like a scab being picked. The city folded into its pockets of shadow, and my apartment became a watch post. People in the building moved like ghosts. Marla's muffled footfalls overhead, a neighbor's cough, the refrigerator's steady tick. We waited. The camera's tiny red light blinked. The laptop hummed. At 1:12 a.m., the tapping started again. 2 quick knocks, a pause, 3. It wasn't distant this time. It vibrated through the glass like a pulse. The window vibrated with it. My mouth tasted of pennies. Gavin hit the spotlight switch. We flooded the alley with white that felt like a punishment. For a second, nothing. Then the man stepped out from the deeper black like an actor stepping onto a stage. He wore a cheap coat and a hat pulled low. His face looked like a newspaper photograph left in the rain. He held a pamphlet to his chest the way a religious man holds a Bible. He smiled like someone who knew a secret. Behind him, the tall thing folded out of the shadow. It was less a body than a negative space in the light, an absence that made the spotlight hungry. When the light hit it, the air around it shimmered like heat over asphalt. The thing didn't have features so much as suggestions of features. Where a face should have been, there was a patchwork of shadows. It turned its head toward me in a movement like a hinge. Gavin didn't think. "Police!" he shouted, and the word cracked like a glass bell. The man flinched. I felt the thing's attention like a physical hand. The tapping stopped. From somewhere down the lane, a siren answered, as if they'd been listening for our signal. A neighbor from across the street, a woman named Darlene, who kept strange hours, came out carrying a broom. The lights from other apartments flicked on. The world edged loud and alive. The man tried to run, and in that second, something in him stuttered. He wasn't supernatural. He was human, and you could read the panic on the lines of his face. The taller shape, hungry for the dark, seemed to hesitate at the increasing human noise. The spotlight caught the thing in a way that convinced it the night had teeth. It recoiled, folding like paper you want to burn. It didn't scream. It unstitched itself into the brickwork and the trash cans and then, almost impossibly, dissolved up toward the clouds as if the light had taught it how to unmake itself. Neighbors grabbed the man. He fought like a cornered animal, and in the scuffle, Gavin held his wrist in a grip that would bruise. The police arrived in force, radios buzzing, shoes flashing. The man babbled about debts and names and how he'd only been doing a favor. He had no ID beyond a name that resulted in nothing in the clerk's office. The officers cuffed him and read him rights. One took my statement with a cold pen. "Stalking," he said. "Harassment." The charge fit the man like clothing. It did not fit the taller thing. They took the camera footage to evidence. For a county report, it looked unhelpful. A burst of saturated white, a smear where a body should have been, and then static. Still, the police took the man in, booked him for trespassing and stalking. His pamphlets matched a stack we had run at the press. For reasons that made my throat close, there were no clear prints of the tall thing on any surface. The alley had an indentation on the wall where, under the harsh spotlight, the brick looked slightly melted, as if heat had licked it. In the aftermath, the city talked a little. There were mentions in the local paper, a small column where a reporter used words like bizarre and unexplained. People asked if I was okay. I said I was. I wasn't. None of us were immune to the slow erosion that fear does to the edges of a life. I went back to work a week later. The press whirred with its ordinary, mechanical honesty. The owner sent me home with a look that said he thought I'd had a breakdown. Marla gave me a loaf of bread and refused payment. Months passed. The man, whose name in court was a thin, forgettable thing, pled guilty to trespass and stalking. He claimed he had been involved in a group that performed interventions on people who slept alone. He wanted to wake people up. His lawyers painted him as a disturbed activist. He got a sentence that smelled of papers and bureaucracy. No judge asked about the tall thing. No report in a county office had a footnote that read, "Dissolved into night." I learned to live with certain small terrors. I stopped taking the alley. I left lights on. I learned to sleep in daylight and read until my eyes closed. I learned that a person who has had a shadow pressed against them at midnight will notice the oddities of a city's heartbeat for years. Sometimes, when the apartment is too quiet and the river is a distant silver thread, I still hear a rhythm ghosting in the walls. 2 taps, pause, 3. It is never at a place that suggests danger. Never loud, never rude. Just a punctuation that reminds me the world is larger than the comfortable map I carry in my head. People ask if it was supernatural. People ask if I felt the presence of something non-human. My answer is both an honest maybe and a lie meant to keep others from worrying. I know someone played a part, a man who liked the theater of fear and knew how to push a person into responding. I also know there was a thing that moved wrong in the dark, that didn't appear on tapes the way a human does, that folded when the light grew too honest. Whether it was some mindless hunger or a coin of the city's nightmares, I can only say this. Some things feed on the small certainties we carry, and when those things press against a life, the city opens up strange and secret passages. If you walk these streets at night, keep your light on. Watch the alleys that look like shortcuts. Keep company when you can. Because whatever explanation you prefer, the sound is real and patient and delights in being listened to. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Kincaid. I was 28 years old when it happened, the night of October 12, 2019. I remember the date the way some people remember birthdays. Clear, stubborn, folded into the texture of everything that came after. I tell you that first because when you hear the rest, you'll want something solid to hold on to. A name, an age, a day that was otherwise ordinary. Grand Rapids was home then, a Midwestern city of river bridges and brick storefronts, familiar coffee shops and late-night diners where the waitresses knew your order before you sat down. I worked at a bike shop called Rivet and Roll, an honest place on Leonard Street where we fixed punctures and rebuilt trust, piece by small piece. People called me Tom. My friends called me Kink. The rest of this begins in a way that sounds boring, because most terrifying things do. Before the night changed everything, I was the kind of guy who left his porch light on until dawn. I kept lists on yellow legal pads. I liked the smell of grease and the sound of an old radio humming in the back of the shop. My closest companion was a mutt named Gus, who had more patience than most humans I knew. The small apartment I rented above a laundromat was plain. A couch, 2 chairs, a kitchen table that tilted on one leg, and a bookshelf full of novels I never finished. I liked routine. Routines make you feel safe until the moment they don't. There were other characters in this story, because true stories always have other people waiting in the wings. Mara Lane was my next-door neighbor, a graduate student with a laugh like chipped glass and a penchant for midnight baking. She owned a plant she called Professor Oates. Jake Mercaldi worked at the bar across from the shop, and if he didn't know the right song to put on at 2 a.m., he at least knew the right face to make when someone needed a drink. None of them did anything remarkable on the face of it. They nodded to me, lent me sugar, stole my dog treats, and told me to stop working too hard. Grand Rapids itself felt like a stage set for small dramas. The Grand River ran through it like an old scar, lined with parks where teenagers coughed cigarette smoke into autumn air, and where old men sat with coffee thermoses and hands folded like prayers. That river becomes a character in its own right on cold nights, a witness that hears but doesn't speak. The part of the city where I lived was the kind of place that respects privacy. People mind their own business, and in return, expect theirs to be minded. That compact courtesy is one of the reasons what happened felt so impossible. There were small, telling details in the weeks before the 12th that I ignored because, well, I was a practical person. The streetlight outside the laundromat flickered in a way that made you think the whole city might blink out. A stray cat decided my stoop was its new nap spot. Someone, probably high school kids, tagged the alley behind the shop with a crooked crown. Little things that, collected together, make a night feel slightly off. I tend to notice things. It was careless of me to write off the way my bike lock had been examined one afternoon like a policeman examining a suspect's hands. I told myself it was a locksmith's curiosity. I told myself a lot of things that night. People get creative with explanations because fear doesn't let them live comfortably with the truth. What I didn't tell anyone was that I'd been getting notes. Not full letters, just scraps, a torn-out page from a spiral notebook, a receipt with only a time written on it, a single Polaroid of the laundromat across the street, taken from somewhere across the river. At first I thought they were jokes, pranks in bad taste. I blamed Jake's friends, thought it was someone vying for a laugh. I left the notes on the counter at Rivet and Roll, leaned them against the till like curiosities. I told Mara about the Polaroid when she asked why Gus kept pawing at the pocket where I hid treats. She laughed, said maybe I had a secret admirer. I laughed too, because laughter is a good way to keep a thin wall between yourself and the idea that the unknown might be paying you attention. In the week leading up to October 12th, the notes became more deliberate. One had a single sentence scrawled in block letters. You forget too easily. Another was a map, the kind drawn by hand with a shaky X near Riverside Park. The handwriting changed. It wasn't consistent. Whoever left them knew, in a disquieting way, what made me nervous. They knew about my habit of leaving the radio on to fall asleep, about my tendency to walk Gus the same route at the same time. They were learning my rhythms. That was the moment the easy jokes died. You notice that in horror stories. The small, private things that let you know someone watched you arrange your day like an experiment. I debated calling the police. I didn't at first because the notes were just that, notes. They didn't yet cross the threshold into threats. But someone else's courage feels cheap in a house where your own thoughts have suddenly become loud and suspicious. So instead, I started doing things people do when they try to retake some control. I changed the route of my walks, I carried a flashlight on late-night trips to the shop, and I took to sleeping in the living room with the front light on. Gus preferred the bedroom, but he followed me like a shadow. I felt about as prepared as a man can feel when the rules he once trusted start to erode. The main story, the part you keep asking for, the reason you're reading this, doesn't begin with a bang. It begins with a missed bus and a fog that made the streetlights halo like moons. It begins, really, when I walked past the old iron bridge at 11:47 p.m., and a figure stepped out from the dark underpass like it had always been waiting there. That's where the ordinary cracked, and the rest of the night slid through that crack like cold water. I remember the way the asphalt smelled that night, like gasoline and wet leaves, and how absolutely normal the sky was above us, a spread of indifferent stars, while something very specific and personal began to unravel beneath them. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The figure didn't speak. It simply stood in the shadow beneath the bridge until my brain stitched together the idea of a person from the darkness. Gus went rigid at my side, his low growl a thing that makes your palms slick. The light from the laundromat caught the edge of the figure's face, enough to show an angle of cheekbone, a pale line where a jaw met the night. For a second, I thought it might be someone I knew, some stranger who'd taken the same late walk out of habit. Then the way it moved, deliberate, almost like someone stepping in and out of a tape loop, told me otherwise. "Hey," I said, too loud, the sound ricocheting off concrete. My voice sounded like someone else's voice in a movie. The figure shifted, and for a breath I thought it would step forward, reach for me, confess some mundane reason for being there. Instead, it reached into its coat and pulled out another Polaroid. It raised it, and the flash, a single soft white bloom, lit the underside of the bridge like a camera shutter finally opening. My legs wanted to run. Gus lunged, tugging me toward the footpath, raw with the instinct that whatever stood there was not friendly. But that photograph mattered. It was the same kind I'd found before, the same scrap of frozen grain and skewed perspective. In the light, the figure turned the Polaroid like a page and showed me what it had captured. My apartment, from above, the living room lit up with the television on, a couch shadow where I slept, the little coffee table with the maps and my yellow legal pads. My coffee mug sat at the center, and on the table, clear as a punctuation mark, was a second Polaroid, a Polaroid of Tom Kincaid asleep on the couch, the television's blue glow painting his face. I remember the way my throat closed. The figure did not laugh. It did not offer apologies. It folded the Polaroid back into its pocket and melted into the dark like a cut in the city's skin, sealing itself. I stood there, motionless, Gus whimpering at my side, because the world had rearranged itself into an assertion. Someone had been inside my home while I slept. After that night, sleep was a fragile country I could no longer enter without a passport. I started taking shifts in the shop and sleeping behind the counter under a thin blanket, the color of old paper. I woke at odd intervals, every creak magnified, every passing car a possible visitor. I changed the locks on the apartment door, and then, because paranoia breeds method, I took photos of every possible entry point with my phone. Windows, the fire escape, the laundry room door below the stoop. Each photo was cataloged and labeled with a timestamp. I put a cheap security camera outside the front window, wired it to a battered laptop, and watched the footage like a man watching a pot he thinks might boil over at any moment. I told Jake in the bar one afternoon because keeping it in your head makes it harder to breathe. He frowned, the familiar bartender's frown, and said I should go to the police. I had already thought of that, had considered the neatness of reports and fingerprints and a man in a uniform steadying a notebook. But what do you do when what you're dealing with is a series of intimate invasions? Evidence can be a slippery thing. "They'll tell you to keep a log," Jake said, as if that would make the fear respectable. "They'll say it might be a prank, or maybe a neighbor's kid." I did call them. Officer Ben Ortiz, a steady man with a voice that treats danger like paperwork, came by and took down the details. He listened without folding his face into sympathy, the way people do when they are trained not to make promises they can't keep. He took my photographs, my Polaroids, the note with the shaky map, and his expression never changed. He filed it under stalking, but his eyes asked me if I had any enemies. I told him no, or rather, I told him not, that I could think of. He suggested cameras, locks, a list of practicalities that became the litany of the hours I spent awake. But police forms are not the same as seeing. Forms don't make your dog less spooked or your stomach less like a fist. The camera I set outside the apartment door captured long periods of static, and then at 3:12 a.m. on October 15th, it caught a shadow cross the stoop. The person, someone small and careful, moved like a cat, pausing to lean into the mail slot as if to listen. The frame was grainy, but the shoulders, the gait, the hat all matched nothing I knew. I printed the stills and pinned them above the desk at rivet and roll like a grim bulletin board. The map with the X, the map that had first made me think someone was intentionally drawing me into a place, kept nagging at me. It marked Riverside Park with that crude X and a date scribbled, OCT 19th. Whoever had sent these notes was giving me invitations. They were choosing a place and a time and expecting, perhaps, that curiosity would win. People in thrillers and true crime shows always warn against answering a stalker's summons. But people who live in cities also know that your life is made of choices between two bad options. Either you hide and live half alive, or you go because the not knowing becomes an ache you can't ignore. On the 19th, I walked to Riverside Park at dusk with Gus on a leash and Jake insisting on coming as backup. Mara, who had refused to be counted out of my life after I told her about the Polaroids, came too, a thermos of coffee and a bag of those forgettable cookies she made when she wanted to feel useful. The park was quiet, the river a dark glass, the path lit by lamps that threw little coin-sized circles of light on the pavement. The X on the map corresponded to a bench near the river, beneath a stand of maples that had started the slow burn of autumn. We waited. It felt obscene and against all rules of self-preservation. The minutes stretched, people jogged by with headphones, oblivious. A man walked his dog and laughed at something on his phone. The city, for all its capacity for malice, still held its routine. We sat on the bench in the false comfort of numbers, 3 people instead of 1, and watched the opposite bank for movement. At 8:03 p.m., a figure stepped from between the maples on the far side of the path. It was not the same figure from the bridge. It walked with a different slouch, wore a different coat. It carried something wrapped in a canvas bag. My breath condensed in the cold like a smell. The figure placed the bag on the ground and, without looking at us, turned away and walked slowly toward the river. We were all too far apart for shouting to matter. Jake started to rise, and the figure's hand flicked back. It raised a single finger. Not a threat, not a greeting, and then turned and disappeared into the trees. Trembling, Mara and I crossed the path. The bag was unremarkable. A painter's bag, stained with splotches, and inside it were more Polaroids. There were 10 of them, laid out like a deck of cards. Pictures of me biking home, pictures of Gus waiting by the door, a Polaroid of the laundromat with the exact window where I slept, highlighted by a single square of light. The last one, the one at the bottom of the stack, was different. In it, I recognized the back alley behind Rivet and Roll, and written on the white margin in thick black ink were the words, "You forget too easily." We took the bag to the police station that night. Officer Ortiz examined the photos with a clinical calm. "Someone wants your attention," he said. "That's clear." He asked if I'd had odd customers at the shop, any fights, any threats. I had none of the things that fit neatly into criminal narratives. What I had were crumbs and shadows and a sense of being observed by a person who loved the craft of getting under skin. They placed an extra patrol near my apartment for a week. They logged the incident. They did their job, which is to keep a city from dissolving into rumor and chaos. But their presence was not a shield that reached into the corners where the real fear lived. And the photos, the notes, the mapped X's, they suggested a mind at work, not a mind that was merely capricious. Whatever had started as mischief had turned into design. That night, after we left the station, Jake walked me back to the shop. The street smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Gus patted at my heels, a constant of fur and loyalty in a landscape of shifting trust. For the first time since the bridge, something in me hardened. If someone wanted a story with me as its meat, then I would stop letting the narrative be written only by the one who watched. I would look too. I didn't know yet whether that decision would save me or ruin me, but it was a decision all the same. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After the Riverside bag, I stopped pretending I could keep this at arm's length. I layered my defenses like a man stacking plates he hopes won't break. Motion lights, an extra deadbolt, a second cheap camera pointed at the alley. I taught myself how to wire 2 webcams into a single feed and watched it on a phone that never left my side. I stopped sleeping on the couch and started sleeping where I could see the front window. I learned how to set my jaw the way people do before they walk into a hospital room, as if a certain expression could hold fate at bay. The city seemed smaller when you're watching it through a screen, as if everyone was a possibility and every shadow was a name. Patterns emerged. The Polaroids had a habit of capturing me from the east, from the Iron Bridge, from the Riverwalk, from the back alley that ran behind Rivet and Roll. There were angles only someone who knew my apartment's layout could find. A shuttered upstairs window that looked down into the living room, a narrow gap in the neighboring building's service entrance. Whoever had been taking these photos wasn't stumbling into view by accident. I started spending closing hours at the shop. There, under fluorescence and the smell of chain oil, I felt less exposed. Jake would sometimes sit with me till the stored lamps clicked off, and his cigarettes fizzed in the ashtray. Mara came by with coffee and a stack of printouts I'd made of the stills from the cameras. We traced lines on a map, not unlike the one in the first note, connecting the vantage points. We made a list of plausible people who knew those angles: maintenance workers, delivery drivers, late-night joggers, a handful of regulars who liked to take photographs of the river at dusk. One name kept repeating in the margins of conversations, not because anyone accused him, but because of how he fit into the corners. Elliot Shaw. He'd come into the shop a few times last year to fix a flat and talk about old cameras. He liked to shoot film and collect odd lenses, the sort of man who'd been born with a Polaroid in his pocket. Elliot had a polite way of looking at things that made you feel like he was cataloging them, committing them to some private museum. He also lived near the Iron Bridge. I told myself not to triangulate with conjecture. But people look like suspects when you make a list, and lists are comforting. So we watched. 2 nights in a row, nothing happened but ordinary life. A couple walked past with a stroller. A man on a bike rang his bell and muttered apologies for crowding the path. On the 3rd night at 2:14 a.m., one of my outdoor cams caught a man in a gray coat crossing the stoop and leaning into the mail slot. The frame was grainy, but the shoulders, the gait, the flat-brimmed cap were, to my tired, hungry mind, almost like the figure from beneath the bridge. I printed the still and stuck it to the wall above my workbench. We were impatient in the way people get when fear hardens into a plan. I set a bait. I left the living room lit, a Polaroid face up on the coffee table like an invitation, and told Jake and Mara to be on standby. If this person cared about the ritual of the Polaroids, maybe they'd come to see the newest one. I wanted to catch them doing what they did best: watching. At 1:03 a.m., I saw movement through the window on the feed. Not the slow cat-like slide I'd seen before, but precise, practiced steps. Whoever it was moved with the confidence of someone who knew where the lights threw soft pools and where to avoid glare. My throat tightened. I kept the laptop screen between me and the window like a shield and watched the outline come into frame. The flat cap, the shoulders, the hands tucked into pockets. He paused at the stoop, as if listening. My fingers left prints on the plastic keys of the laptop. He let himself in through the side door. The sound of the latch snapping open seems small until small things are all you have. The building groaned like a living thing settling into its old habits. I slid the door open and met him in the narrow hall between the shop and the back room, where bike frames leaned like patient skeletons and tires smelled faintly of rubber and road. He was closer than the camera had shown. Up close, his face was younger than I'd pictured, his cheeks pale and hollow, his eyes like 2 flat coins. He didn't bother to hide anymore. "You shouldn't have left it out," he said. His voice had the soft flatness of a tape recorded and played back too many times. He had no name on the tip of his tongue for me to grab onto, no small talk. He had the cataloger's calm, the kind that knows details but keeps them for itself. "Who are you?" I said, the question a brittle thing in the dark. He smiled without warmth. "You forget," he said. And that was the line he'd written on my Polaroids, the accusation made corporeal. I lunged because fear teaches your limbs to act when your head can't. We grappled near a workbench, my shoulder knocking into a lamp, his coat catching on a rusty wrench. I tasted copper on my tongue where my lip split. He moved with a weird, economical force, like someone who had practiced small, precise violences. I struck at his wrist, more to make him flinch than to hurt him, and the cap fell, revealing dark hair plastered to his scalp. For the first time, I could see him properly. His eyes were not the wild, unhinged eyes I'd imagined, but something colder, more deliberate. He had a knife at his belt. The sight of it, a short, clean blade barely peeking out, turned the struggle into arithmetic. I was more afraid of that knife than of any hand. He pushed me back and reached for a shelf. In the flash of motion, I smelled a chemical tang and realized he'd sprayed something into the air. My throat closed. I stumbled as my ears filled with a ringing, and the shop multiplied sideways like a painting tilted in someone's hand. I staggered toward the door, pulled myself through the frame into the alley, and saw that Mara and Jake were already there, flashlights cutting blunt holes into the night. The man, my man without a name, had melted between stacks of trash and rust. For a second, he looked like nothing more than a suggestion. "Call it in," Jake hissed. He had the steady voice of someone who'd seen fights before and learned to name them quickly. Mara's hand was on my shoulder. It was light, but anchoring. My mouth tasted of metal and fear. The police arrived in a measured time, and Officer Ortiz's face went from paper calm to something close to concern when he saw the cut on my lip and the bruise blooming at my temple. We gave statements, showed the feed that recorded the man entering, and pointed to the missing cap. He promised to increase patrols to note patterns. The city did what it could in the language it knew, timestamps and patrol cars, a form signed and filed. But when I replayed the video in the quiet hours, I noticed something odd. As the man moved through the shop, he had lingered not at the sofa or contrary items, but at the small shelf behind the till where I'd kept an old photo album. It was mine, a book of family photos I'd brought from home after my mother died. It had pictures of me at 8, ATV before a fall, the porch where we barbecued. I remembered clearly, the angle was exactly like one of the Polaroids found earlier, a picture of me asleep with the old album at my side. In the video, the man thumbed through it like a priest with liturgy, as if he had been looking for something precise. The cap we'd found later that night in a gutter across the street bore a smudge of oily print and, tucked beneath the brim, a small Polaroid. It was a photo of me as a child, the sun high and my hair wet from a sprinkler. Someone in the city had been collecting my life like a set of trading cards. I realized then that this had never been random. This was a construction. The Polaroids, the map, the nocturnal scouting, it wasn't just about watching me sleep. It was about building my story into something someone else could understand perfectly. He wanted me to remember in the exact terms he chose. He wanted to own the memory of me. That night, I lay awake and counted the breaths between my heartbeats and tried to will sleep to come, because exhaustion is sometimes the only thing that keeps you moving in the morning. The city outside my window hummed like a giant refrigerator. I thought of the man in the gray coat and the knife, the way he'd moved his hands over my old photos like a man rearranging someone else's life. I thought of how intimate not being seen can be, how dangerous it is to be made small and then cataloged. I didn't tell the police about the note I found in the cap's lining. I carried it folded into my wallet like a splinter. On it, in the same thick black ink, were 2 words, "Remember me." It felt less like a threat and more like an offer, to join a club I never wanted to be part of. I had been given the first real choice since the bridge: hide and let him script my life, or step back into the places he used to watch and show him I could look back. I chose to look. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The plan was ugly and practical, and the kind of thing you do when you can't afford to be sentimental. Officer Ortiz agreed to coordinate a sting, extra patrols, plainclothes officers stationed at fixed points, radio silence unless something moved. I told myself I was going to catch whoever had been carving my life into Polaroids. I told myself the only acceptable ending was one with a name and a handcuff. Mara and Jake stayed with me that night. We sat in the cramped back room of Rivet and Roll like conspirators around a table, shoulders close, coffee cooling in disposable cups. Gus lay across my boots, his breathing a metronome. The bait was simple. Another Polaroid, face up on the coffee table under the living room lamp, the image deliberately mundane. Me, asleep on the couch, the television muted, the old photo album on my lap. I left a light on in the kitchen so it would glow through the blinds just enough for anyone watching to see. The rest, I hoped, would be done by the city and the law. At 1:47 a.m., the feed showed movement. The practiced slide of someone who had been in the choreography before. He came through the side gate like a shape that belonged to the night, shoulders hunched against the cold as if he were carrying the air of 1,000 unmade things. I felt something like a drumbeat in my molars. Officer Ortiz radioed that plainclothes were in position, and it felt for a breath like we were characters in a police procedural where everything lines up just so. He walked into the apartment the way the other man had, sure, careful, as if he had a right to be there. But when he looked up and saw the light and the faces and the badge gleaming in the corner of the room, his expression broke. He didn't run. He folded like something made of paper. Officer Ortiz and two other men were on him in a breath, a closed hand at his arm, a voice that was firm and compassionate at once. They cuffed him and sat him on the stoop while they called for transport. He was younger than I expected, but older than the polite face who sometimes came into the shop to talk about lenses. He had the same angular jaw I'd glimpsed under the bridge, but his eyes were wet and raw like somebody who'd been awake too long, like somebody who'd been living for a single brittle idea. "Name?" Ortiz asked, low and competent. He looked at me then, and the thing I hadn't wanted, the need for his recognition, arrived in the room. "Elliot Shaw," he said. The name landed with a small, terrible finality. It was the one I'd suspected and not wanted to name, because suspicion makes you rougher toward people. I realized the comfort of lists had been precisely my undoing. I'd put names on a board and pointed at them like a jury forming in the dark. They put him in the cruiser and drove him to the station. The station gets bright at hours like that, fluorescent and honest. Inside, Elliot sat with his hands folded, his gaze refusing the ceiling. Officer Ortiz sat with him and let him speak, because sometimes the truth comes out if you stop blocking people's mouths. He told them he took pictures because he couldn't keep stillness inside his head. He told them he watched because he was afraid of being forgotten, not just by strangers, but by the people he thought mattered. "I see things," he said to Ortiz in a voice that had the tired cadence of confession. "I find things. I set them down where people will see them. And said if they look back, then I'm not nothing." When he said my name, there was no hate in it. There was a pleading that felt like a wound. "You laugh at things you don't mean," he told me directly later in a witness room while the officers wrote and the camera hummed. "You move on. You don't remember small faces you pass. I wanted to make you remember me. I wanted you to see me." The detective's question, the one that pried beneath his rhetoric, was simple. Why me? Elliot's answer was messier. He'd been a neighbor once, a face in the crowd who thought I had been casually cruel. He claimed to have seen me walk away from an argument a year earlier, a fight between me and someone he loved. It felt petty and personal and achingly human. He'd made my life into his way of being seen. He'd scaled that need into obsession. He'd learned my rhythms so he could carve them into memory. I wanted to be furious in the templatized way you read about, to stand and lecture about boundaries and law. Part of me was. Mostly I felt small and tired and embarrassingly a little guilty. People who get watched sometimes find themselves cataloged a second time for faults, for things they might have said or not said. Elliot's confession was not an absolution. It was a mirror. He pled guilty to stalking, trespass, and possession of tools with intent. The judge gave him a sentence that was long enough to be meaningful and short enough to leave room for someone to get help. He was ordered to attend counseling and to stay away from my address. The city offered a small, quiet closure that looked like paperwork and a restraining order and an officer who agreed to walk Gus and me home for a while. I remember signing my name at the courthouse with a hand that trembled less than the first nights, but still had the shadow of fear. People asked in the weeks after if I felt safe. No would have been honest and useless, so I said what I felt I should. Safer. There was a relief in knowing we had a name, in seeing Elliot, labeled on a docket. There was also the subtle, disquieting realization that the world still held people who sought to be remembered by making someone else forget everything but them. Life returned to its rhythms in small increments. I repaired bikes. I sold handlebars. I learned slowly to lock my door without feeling like it was an admission of cowardice. Gus slept at the foot of the bed again, though I still left the lamp on some nights. Mara baked more cookies, and Professor Oates survived an alarming infestation of something that made its leaves curl like folded paper. Jake kept making the kind of small talk that smooths edges. "You'll be all right, Tom," he'd say, refilling a coffee cup, as if repetition worked like a spell. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I would think of the Polaroids spread out on the bench in Riverside Park, and the way the river kept rolling without noticing whether we were watched or not. I would think about Elliot's confession, the way wanting to be seen can morph into something that takes instead of gives. And I would think, finally, about how memory is not a thing to be demanded. It is a thing you earn back slowly from yourself. A year later, I ran into Elliot outside the courthouse after a hearing. He'd shaved, and his eyes had that duller, less feverish look of someone who had stopped polishing an obsession into a weapon. He nodded to me like a man who'd learned a hard lesson about the shape of his hands. I nodded back. We didn't talk. There was nothing to add. The exchange felt like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I couldn't have written well even if I had tried. If there's a moral in this, and I've never liked thumping morals into stories like a benediction, it is that the ordinary life you think is secure is often just that. Ordinary. Ordinary does not mean safe. It just means your dangers are the ones that fit into the smallest cracks. It's also that people who hurt us are sometimes people who have been hollowed out by different things. That doesn't excuse them, but it changes the way you carry the knowledge of them. Months stitched into a new year. Gus grew a little grayer. I learned to sleep with a lamp at my elbow and the radio low. The camera footage I had once watched like scripture became, in time, something I could glance at without my chest tightening. The city kept being the city. River, bridges, late-night diners with someone to refill your coffee and take your order. Sometimes I'll walk past the iron bridge at night and remember the figure stepping out of the dark. Sometimes I think about the small Polaroids scattered like constellations across my life. I keep them now in a plastic sleeve, a reminder that being seen is a responsibility we all share to ourselves and to one another. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 28 the night it happened, November 12th, 2016. People ask me still why I was in Grand Rapids that week. Work, a stupid dare, bad timing. The truth is more ordinary and therefore perhaps worse. I had moved back to Michigan after being away for a few years and was working odd jobs, part-time at an antiques warehouse by the riverside doing restorations and deliveries. That November, I was cataloging pieces from the old Westbrook estate, a sprawling, half-forgotten property on the east side of the Grand River. On the night of the 12th, I was driving back from a visit to my sister's apartment in Easttown when my van cut out on Leonard Street, near the rusting skeleton of the Riverside paper mill. It was a place people crossed quickly, never looked up, where winter smells like wet metal and riverweed. That was where, and that was when. You need to understand the city as I knew it then. Grand Rapids had pockets that felt like they belonged to someone else. A mismatch of startups and shuttered storefronts, college crowds, and older men who sat under the same traffic light every morning. I knew a handful of neighbors. Lucas Bennett, who drove a pizza truck and had an ironic beard. Margot Hale, who ran a coffee shop with thrifted chairs and a laugh that made strangers feel like friends. And Tommy Griggs, a retired lineman who drank too much and told better ghost stories than any of us deserved to hear. There was also Officer Renee Carter, not the sort of cop who showed up on reality TV, but someone who could usually sort out a problem with a look and a name. When I say the community felt like a patchwork, I mean it in the way you patch a coat to keep warm. Each scrap helps, but none of it is seamless. The nights in November get sharp. They cut through you if you're unprepared. I was that night. Half-finished restoration notes in my bag, a thermos with stale coffee, a list of phone numbers I meant to call back. The van decided to die at the worst possible time. A dark strip of Leonard, unsupported by sidewalk lights, where the trees leaned close and the river seemed to swallow sound. I stepped out, slammed the door, and the cold hit like a hand. The first hour was the kind of annoyance that doesn't register as fear. I tried to start the van, cursed at the dead battery, and decided to walk to Margot's place to use her phone. I texted Lucas to say I might be late. He replied with a string of emojis and a promise to bring jumper cables if I needed them. For reasons that feel ridiculous to narrate now, I took the long way along the river because the route passed the old Westbrook Gate and the moon picked out details on the water in the way I used to think of as cinematic. There was a thrill to being alone with those buildings. The mill chimneys, the boarded windows, the way the city's history lined up in layers. Before I reached the footbridge, I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was a man in a coat leaning against the iron railing, just some drifter passing time. Then he moved, and the motion was wrong. He stepped from shadow to light with a kind of rehearsal behind it, like someone testing a part. He didn't look at me. He watched the water. My stomach tightened, but I shrugged it off. People watch rivers, they collect in doorways. Still, instinct hammered. Keep your distance, keep your options. I walked on, leaving the figure behind me, the night folding again. I had met the guy before at the warehouse, a courier who handled odd deliveries, always nosing around old crates. A man who introduced himself as Jonah Pike. He had an easy smile and a scar along his knuckle from some forgotten scrape. I thought it was him from the silhouette, and thinking it was Jonah put me at ease. That was a mistake, simple and human, and it is the kind of mistake every victim remembers, the small, mundane choice that becomes the hinge of everything that follows. I reached the coffee shop where Margot was closing. She handed me the phone with her gloves on, worry furrowing her forehead. I called Lucas. He said he was 5 minutes away. He never arrived. When I hung up, the bell above the door rang, and there he was, the same figure from the bridge standing in the doorway, soaked by the November air, with Jonah's crooked gait. He smiled like Jonah. He said he was cold. He said his van had broken down near the mill. Margot, with the kindness that had always gotten her into trouble, offered him a seat and a cup. He sat but didn't warm. He watched me as if counting. For the next few minutes, mundane things happened around an axis I couldn't yet see. We exchanged small talk, where I worked, how the antiques were coming along, Lucas's pizza schedule. The man, Jonah, I thought, mentioned the Westbrook property in a way that suggested he knew more than a delivery driver should. He knew which rooms had been sealed, which artifacts were missing. That should have been a clue. Instead, it made conversation richer. He asked about my van. I told him it had stalled on Leonard. He nodded like someone who took notes. When he left, he said he'd check on it, offered to help jump it, and I believed him, because believing is easier than considering the alternative, that a stranger's interest could be purposive and cold. The main part of the night, when the ordinary cracked and revealed whatever terrible thing lay beneath, begins after that, after the laugh, after the handshake, after I let him go without thinking that I should have asked for his last name. The details that come next are the ones people ask for when they want to make sense of what happened. I will tell them in order, raw and imperfect, because it's the only honest way I have. I found my van later, not where I had left it. Its engine was still dead, but it was moved about 30 yards into a shadowed lot behind the mill, the driver's door open. The keys were where I'd left them. My jacket was missing. My phone, the one I had used to call Lucas, was on the passenger seat, but locked, the battery drained. The handwriting of the night had changed. What began as inconvenience had become a deliberate rearrangement of my world. I called Lucas again and got his voicemail, then Officer Carter, but the call wouldn't go through. Someone had cut the signal lines around Leonard, I would learn later, a localized interference that felt surgical. I didn't know how to process the sensation of a place being altered so intimately. You come to expect your life to be continuous. Keys where you left them, friends who answer. To find an object moved, a door open, is like discovering a sentence missing from your life story. It sparks panic in the rational and the silly alike. Am I dreaming? Did I leave it like that? Was I drugged? I walked toward the mill, toward the shadow where the figure had disappeared. The river sounded like a wound beside me. That is where the terror first spoke clearly. From the undergrowth near the mill's foundation came a sound. Not the river, not wind, but a low, deliberate scraping, like someone trying to unearth something with slow patience. I stopped. My heart thudded with the animal alarm I've learned to trust. The night did something else then. It tilted, as if the city had leaned in to watch. I could hear my own breathing, loud and absurd. I thought about running, about calling for help. Instead, I walked closer. If you ask why, whether courage or stupidity or some desperate need to inspect the edge of the abyss, I can't give you a noble answer. I wanted to know what had been done with my things. When I pushed aside a rusted fence and stepped into the lot, I saw the boot prints. They led toward the mill's back door, and then, fatally, down into the darker mouth where the loading docks had been boarded. The prints were human but oddly precise, as if someone had walked on purpose to mark a path. There was a smear of something on the concrete, a dark smear that caught what little moonlight there was and held it like a promise. I got close enough to see it was not oil. It was, without a doubt, blood. What happened after that? The pounding in my chest, the knocking on the mill's door, the lights that seemed to arrive late, the half-truths people told me when they came, is the story I was dragged into. It reached out from the mill like a cold hand, pulling me into rooms I didn't remember entering, and making me exchange one version of myself for another, a man who slept through the dark and a man who now keeps the blinders on. The rest of that night, and the weeks that followed, are stitched with interviews and dead ends and the kind of small revelations that don't bring comfort. They bring only more questions. I'll stop here for now. But know this, the terror wasn't only what happened in that lot or inside the mill. It was how close it felt afterward, like the city had rearranged itself to hide a truth, and how every ordinary corner kept the memory of that night waiting. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When I called Officer Renee Carter again, this time from a payphone, Margot let me use behind the shop. She arrived within the hour, not because she was fast, but because she understood urgency in a way the rest of us fumbled. She pulled up in an old cruiser that smelled like coffee and paperwork, and when she stepped out, she looked as if she had been expecting something bad all night. She listened without interrupting, then walked me back to the lot with a flashlight that trembled as much as my hands. Her face, when it caught the smear on the concrete, didn't change in the dramatic ways you see on TV. It tightened like a fist. "Stay where I can see you," she said, and it wasn't rude. It was the kind of command that kept chaos in a box. 2 other patrol cars rolled up soon after. No sirens, just careful headlights, and we opened the mill like you open an old wound. Slowly, with the thought of what we might release in mind. The loading dock door was pried, not broken. Tools, not violence. Whoever had been here had the time and the patience to be careful. Inside, the mill smelled of wet wood and old machinery, with a sweet chemical undertone that made my head tilt. The main floor had been cleared of years of dust in a narrow path that led past rusting conveyor belts to a back stairwell. Someone had used the place recently. There were cigarette butts in a corner where no one should be smoking, and footprints that matched my van's tire treads in dried mud near the old elevator pit. My pulse picked up so fast I thought the room was shaking. Renee kept a hand near her radio, and the other officers moved like they'd been taught. Methodical, polite, and not touching. They questioned me in the doorway in little doses. What I had last done, who I had seen, whether anyone had reason to hurt me. I told them Jonah's name because I thought it true, and because the last person you want to lie to in a situation like that is someone with a badge. One of the officers, a younger guy with a face full of freckles, went up the stairs. A flashlight beam found a door at the top, and behind it, a narrow corridor that smelled of mildew and something else. The metallic tang that now lives in my mouth whenever I think of that night. We found a room that had been made with intent. Not a storage room, not a break room. There were blankets, folded into triangular stacks, a water jug with plastic cups, and on the floor, a set of children's shoes that didn't belong to anyone in my life. I remember the way my throat closed. It wasn't the presence of the shoes alone. It was the messy human logic behind them, the idea they had been placed with purpose for someone else. There were marks on the wall where hooks had been removed, a calendar with dates crossed off in a hurried hand, and then, near the back, something that made me step back until my boot hit a crate. It was my jacket, the one I'd thought lost on Leonard, draped over a chair. The zipper was open and my initials were stitched inside. The air in the room shrank around me. Officer Renee took a breath and called for a detective. The mill, which had been a background to so many harmless nights, had become a set of clues that fit together only to make a picture I didn't want to see. They took statements for hours. Lucas came with jumper cables and a face full of apologies. Margot brought coffee again and sat with me on the curb as the detective interviewed everyone as if we were all suspects and witnesses simultaneously. I gave them everything I could remember, the silhouette on the bridge, the man in the coffee shop, Jonah's small talk, and they wrote it down with the same neutral handwriting. Detectives have ways of making you feel both invisible and exposed. I wanted to be invisible. The first night, they didn't, arrest anyone. They couldn't. The man I'd seen might have been Jonah, or he might have been somebody else wearing Jonah's gait, like a costume. There was a photograph on the detective's table of Jonah Pike pulled from some social media account they found keyed to the courier service. He looked like what he had claimed to be, too young to be menacing, with a jaw that smiled too easily. But in the corner of the photograph, behind his shoulder, something else glimmered. The mill, or structure very much like it. Detective Alvarez, who smelled like cheap aftershave and good notebooks, kept that photo folded against his palm the way people hold a card in a poker game. In the days that followed, my life bifurcated. There was the public thread. Interviews, the neighbors' whispers, email chains between the antique warehouse and the police that had nothing to do with the gut-level panic thrumming in my chest. There was the private thread. The sleep I couldn't hold, the flashes that didn't obey logic. Sometimes I would remember walking along the river and suddenly know I had been somewhere else for a sliver of time, a standing in darkness that wasn't the absence of light, but a presence. When I spoke about those gaps, people would nod and use words like dissociation or shock. When I tried to force my memory into a map, the details would slip like wet fingers. A week later, there was a knock at my door before dawn. It was Detective Alvarez with a state-issued duffel slung over his shoulder. He had news, but he didn't say it bluntly. He said, "We found something else at the mill," and the words landed like stones. In the duffel were objects cataloged and bagged, a child's pencil with teeth marks, a strip of fabric that matched the thread in my jacket, and a tattered notebook with handwriting that started neat and then collapsed into erratic strokes. There was also a key ring with a van key that had been filed down at the edges. My van's key altered. The notebook was the worst. It was the kind of thing people write in because they can't tell anyone else. Names were in it, as if a small person had learned to write and then been forced into a ledger of observation. The entries were dated, sometimes with only month and year, sometimes with a day that had been crossed out and rewritten. One entry was about a noise that came at night, like a machine breathing. Another listed times when someone, maybe a child, had been allowed to go outside under supervision. Toward the back, the handwriting became panicked. Single words, a smudge that could have been a tear, or something worse. The detective read it and then, in a courtesy I'd never known the police to offer before, handed it to me with both hands. "You should see this," he said. "It's connected." What was connected was a pattern. Over the next weeks, calls came in from parents who had reported missing laptops, small items, memories of a van with a driver who offered to bring someone something and never came back. The city started to hum with the periphery of fear. Locked doors, extra batteries in pockets, neighborhood chats firing off like flares. The press smelled a story and slotted it into a headline template that made my private terror into public fodder. I would watch myself on a grainy screen, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, and feel like a stranger watching a version of me getting interviewed. And Jonah Pike? He was real enough to have a criminal history that matched small-time thefts, but he had friends and an alibi for the night the detectives thought he was in the mill. We found no definitive evidence tying him to the scene besides being in the right neighborhood at the right time. He disappeared a week after the mill raid, vanishing like a ghost whose obituary was neglect. Later, after public pressure, the police found traces of occupation in other buildings along the river. A chain of makeshift rooms where people had stashed things and slept. People who had been going missing in small, sometimes explainable ways were suddenly connected into a web that looked like design. I spent nights in my apartment replaying the room with the children's shoes, my jacket on the chair, the notebook in a plastic bag. I tried to build a chronology to put events in order so they would be comprehensible. Instead, I collected moments that hurt like small knives. The way Officer Renee looked at me when she asked if I had enemies. Lucas's silent fury when he couldn't do anything but lend me cables. Margot's hands on my shoulder when I said I felt like I had been watched not by eyes but by a method. I started to see the city in halves. The half that I could name and the half that contained things without names. One night, about a month after the mill, I woke to find my phone missing from the nightstand. It was locked in the glove compartment of my van, where I'd left it after an argument with an officer about whether I had been careful enough. On the screen was a photo I did not take, a shot from the inside of the mill's back room, taken from the angle of someone sitting on the floor. There was a shadow in it that was not quite human. My stomach fell like a trapdoor. Whoever had taken that photo was close enough to stand where I had stood and close enough to watch. That's where I'll leave you for now, with the city shrinking and small evidence piling into the shape of something larger. The detective said they were building a case. Renee said to be careful. Lucas said he'd sleep in the van with the jumper cables and a baseball bat. I learned to lock things in new ways. But locks are only good against two kinds of threats. That they stop the careless and the petty. They do nothing against someone who already understands the ways people trust the ordinary. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. They called it a pattern before anyone wanted to admit what that meant. Not just thefts or break-ins, but a sequence of small violences stitched together by design. Detective Alvarez brought the terminology home to me in a way that sounded clinical and therefore more terrifying. Predatory, he said, tapping the side of his nose as if that would explain it. Organized. Those were words you used when you were trying to turn a story into evidence. They did little for my heart. The weeks after the mill raid blurred into a succession of practicalities. Interviews, forensic sweeps, hospital visits for people who had been found wandering in a daze and couldn't say where they had been. The antique warehouse put a padlock on the Westbrook inventory room, as if a piece of brass could hold back what had already been done. I started sleeping in short bursts and kept a flashlight on the kitchen table. I stopped leaving my keys in pockets I could not see. But terror is not only a loud, single event. Most of it came as small, precise sabotages meant to unsettle. My bike tires were slashed. Someone untangled the headphones from my jacket and left them in the sink. The television would be on in the morning when I was sure I had turned it off. The night my phone photo of the mill's back room appeared in my glove compartment, someone also sent me a letter in blocky handwriting with a single line, "We're good at finding things. No signature, no claim, just a promise." Detective Alvarez told me not to respond to anything that looked like a taunt. The advice was sensible and useless. When you are being watched, you look for patterns the way someone lost in the woods looks for paths. I found a rhythm to my fear. Check the locks, check the blinds, sleep with a layer of clothes on, carry a knife in my pocket I had never used before in my adult life. Little rituals that make you feel less out of your skin. Then there was the night I almost didn't come back. I had taken to making rounds near the river in the hours before dawn, an irrational attempt to reclaim the city, or a way to meet my own fear in manageable pieces. On one such morning, I walked along the east bank to clear my head. There was a light fog rising off the water, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. I passed the mill and noticed movement in an alley where there shouldn't have been any. Two figures moved with purpose, their silhouettes folded into the dark like origami. For a second, my mind supplied faces, Jonah's crooked profile, a courier's lope, and then reason shoved at me. You don't follow strangers in the pre-dawn, but someone else followed me instead. I felt it before I saw it. The soft scuff of shoes on pavement, the pause that imitates the pause of a person tying their shoe and then continuing. I took a step faster and the step behind me matched. Panic is not a single flavor. This was a slow, rising panic, not the sharp spike I felt when I first saw the mill door open. I ducked into a deli that had lights on and the smell of coffee, as if shop windows were shields. A man in a threadbare jacket came in behind me and ordered something too complicated for the hour. He kept glancing my way. My hands went cold. When I left the deli, he was closer than before. I could see now that he wore a cap pulled low and had a pack slung over one shoulder. He hummed to himself in a tune that didn't exist. I cut down an alley and turned a corner, then another. The footsteps persisted, matching my pace, slowing when I slowed, quickening when I broke into a run. I darted into a bus shelter, crouched, and tried to control my breathing. The man stopped at the opposite curb and looked straight at me, then lifted his hand in something that could have been a greeting or a signal. He walked away. I went home shaking and left the door unlocked as if it was a test for whoever might come. The next morning, a note was tucked under my doormat. It read, in that same blocky handwriting, "You move funny. Don't make it worse." The idea that my movement could be cataloged like a watchmaker making notes about a machine, that someone could reduce my life to adjustable pieces, was worse than any bruising. Detective Alvarez increased the patrols by the river. Officer Renee sat down with me and taught me small, sensible safety moves that felt ashamedly small in the face of whatever we were up against. The investigation found other things, too. The detectives turned up a set of surveillance photos, poorly lit and grainy, taken from places I recognized: a bus stop across from Margot's shop, the alley behind Lucas's pizza truck, a parking meter by my van. There were dozens of images of ordinary nights, of people going about small lives, and tucked between them, a sequence of photographs from inside my apartment. The couch, the coffee table, my jacket draped over the chair like a stage prop. The last photograph in the sequence had been taken in the half-light of my bedroom. You don't need a caption to know what that implies. Someone had been in my space while I slept, close enough to take a vertical, detailed image and leave nothing but a haunting trace. We thought then we had a profile. Someone local, skilled at moving unseen, methodical, patient. Someone who knew how houses felt inside. Someone who had access to keys or could imitate their use. Someone who could be close enough to take pictures from the corner of a room. The idea that this predator could be one of the people we nodded to in the morning, the barista, the delivery driver, the neighbor who watered his plants, draped suspicion over the city like fog. People reacted differently. Margot closed her coffee shop for a day and held a meeting for local business owners. Lucas slept in his truck and kept the radio on. Tommy Griggs, who used to tell ghost stories to make the rest of us laugh, started carrying a flashlight that could have been a strobe light. The community that had once been stitched together with friendly indifference now folded itself inward, with doors latched and eyes watching. In the middle of all this, I found a clue that broke me open and made me act. Detective Alvarez had obtained a trove of items from the mill that included clothing, tools, and a pair of cheap binoculars that, when examined, contained a tiny sticker on the inside hinge, the sort you might find in a thrift store or on a toolbox. On the sticker was a logo, an old security company that had done contracts for local estates and small businesses. Westbrook had used that company years ago to install before they closed. Where a normal person might have filed the sticker away, I found myself staring at it until shapes formed. Westbrook, the mill, the courier. A thread led through all of them. I started canvassing on my own, a range of stupid bravado and practical curiosity. I asked about contractors who had worked at Westbrook, vendors who had keys, people who had come in and out of the mill for maintenance. No one wanted to talk at first. Then, an older man, a retired maintenance worker named Willis Granger, sat with me on a park bench and told me stories in a voice like gravel. He had worked at the Westbrook estate years ago. He had seen contractors who stuck around too long. He remembered vans that came and went at odd hours. He told me with a kind of casual cruelty he didn't intend that buildings remember who touched them. You don't see it till later, he said. The marks don't all go away. Willis gave me a name, not Jonah's, not anybody I'd heard, but a last name that rang like a loose wire in my head. Halloway, a local handyman, small jobs, lots of access, the sort of person who shows up and is invisible because he exists inside the system that keeps things working. He had a habit of using other people's keys for convenience, Will said, and liked to leave notes in people's mailboxes telling them about useful windows. Detective Alvarez followed up. They pulled permits, interrogated vendors, and found a few receipts that placed Halloway at the site of several of the incidents in question. They also found that Halloway had once done a job for the antique warehouse, a simple lock repair, and had been seen talking to Jonah Pike in the weeks before the mill raid. The picture tightened around someone who had the time and proximity to create a web of small intrusions. Confrontation came as these things sometimes do, not as a grand reveal, but as a collapsing door. We arranged for Alvarez and 2 officers to meet me by the river with a plan. I would walk past a known route, and Holloway would, if our intelligence was right, take the bait. Instead, What happened was messier. I saw him in the shadows, lean and quick, and he looked at me with the bored expression of a man who has been recognized before. He smiled without warmth and began to saunter away. I followed. He led me down a path that cut through the back of an old apartment block, then into a service corridor under a laundromat. It was a place designed to be forgotten, and he moved like he had been there 100 times. I called out his name. He turned, and for a moment, something like recognition flickered. We both moved toward each other, and then he bolted, not running, but slipping between shadows like a fish through reeds. Detective Alvarez and the officers converged, voices raised, flashlights obsessing the dark. Holloway slipped into a door that should have been locked, and then a window of light showed him climbing down a fire escape and disappearing into the alley. They tracked him for blocks and found the door open to a basement apartment with a setup that was too messy to be an accident. Maps with names circled, a wall with photographs, and a series of notebooks with dates and short, obsessive entries. There were, disturbingly, names I recognized. People who had complained about thefts, neighbors who had gone missing for short stretches. The detectives bagged everything. It was the closest thing we had to proof that the pattern was deliberate and organized. But proof has a way of being both female and stubborn. Holloway was never convicted of the more serious charges they wanted to pursue because the evidence never stuck where it needed to. He had an attorney who pointed to sloppy warrants and cross-examination hammered at chain of custody. He walked free on a technicality and left us with a hollow victory. We had a suspect and not a solution. After he was released, the city felt different. People looked sideways more often. The mill's silhouette became something to grit your teeth at. But there was also a terrible, stubborn thing that had happened to me personally. Once you know someone has been in the intimate spaces of your life, the world refuses to be ignorant of that knowledge. I started catching myself checking the corners of rooms before I sat, searching for cameras, because even when the detectives had cleared the apartment of physical threats, the idea of being watched lived on like a second skin. And yet, despite the fear, life continued. People went to work, to school, to coffee. The pizza truck still rounded the blocks. Margot kept the shop open, if only for the stubbornness of routine. We learned to live with the shadow by making light. It was an act of defiance that felt almost heroic because it was so ordinary. I didn't know it then, but the third act of the story, the part that would change everything, was already being written in small, quiet ways. The notebooks in Holloway's apartment were only the beginning. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The notebooks in Holloway's apartment were a map made by a hand that thought itself clever. Dates, times, names, little diagrams of windows and door swings. Someone who cataloged human routines like a watchmaker catalogs parts. When Detective Alvarez dug deeper, he found what I hadn't seen in the first panic days. A ledger of payments, thin envelopes folded and labeled, and an old receipt with a company letterhead that pointed to someone with access far above Holloway's pay grade. The name at the top made my stomach drop when Alvarez let it sit on the table between us. Gideon Voss. Gideon Voss was the sort of man who smiled at charity galas and whose name was on benches and plaques. He owned properties, donated to the museum, and had a reputation for fixing things that needed fixing if you paid the right amount. The receipt linked Voss's maintenance company to a series of after-hours jobs at Westbrook and other properties along the river. It didn't prove anything by itself. A receipt is paper. But it made a direction clear. This was not only about a drifter with a penchant for theft. There were people with access and influence who treated other humans like inventory. The plan they cooked up was ugly and simple. Evidence that would stick needed a chain, a recorded exchange, a hand-to-hand transfer, something that put money and instruction in plain view. Alvarez wanted Holloway to trip. Renee wanted to keep me safe. I wanted to do something besides swallow fear and watch it make teeth marks in my life. So we set a trap that felt like the least foolish of our options. I became bait with a little show of money and an invitation to make a deal, all under covert cameras. We staged it in a parking lot behind a shuttered auto shop, a place with cameras we could control and a line of sight into the alley. Margot, stubborn in the best ways, brought coffee and sat in her car with the engine running. Lucas parked his truck 2 stalls over with the lights on. Renee ghosted in the back, in uniform but out of sight. Alvarez had the warrant ready if we needed it, and a photographer to document everything. I felt ridiculous and important in equal measure. We put an envelope in my jacket, anonymized petty cash. The mailbox where Holloway had once left useful windows notes was set up as fluff evidence on a string of bait. My van would break down nearby. Rumor would make the rounds that I had something worth taking. It was theater, and you never know how theater will be received until the curtain rises. Holloway took the bait like a fish taking a nibble. He approached under the pretense of being helpful, the same bored smile I'd seen slip across his face months before. He moved like a man who thought the streets owed him something. I led him past Lucas's truck and into the sightline of the cameras. He reached for the envelope with hands that did not tremble. He was calm, absurdly calm, as if he'd done this 100 times. When the exchange happened, Alvarez and the others moved. Holloway started walking, then turned and ran, the way someone who had been comfortable suddenly remembered the speed of consequence. Alvarez shouted commands. Renee's silhouette appeared at the end of the alley and boxed him in. He fought, small and fierce, but the officers were there, and the weight of law is heavier than the weight of habit. They found a phone in his jacket with messages that linked him to numbers traced to Voss's maintenance company. He had keys that matched locksmith records for several properties. The evidence piled like winter snow. What came after the arrest felt like the part of a storm where you begin counting what's been broken. Holloway talked. He talked in fits and shreds at first, then in a steady spill when the prosecutor put a promise on the table he couldn't refuse. He named a dozen properties where he'd been paid to clean things out, to move belongings, to tidy rooms that had been left vulnerable. He named times and places. He named a handler who arranged payments with envelopes and nods and who had the authority to open doors without explanation. He named Gideon Voss. The name hit different when it belonged to a man who wore bespoke suits and gave speeches about civic responsibility. The indictment that followed read like a conspiracy of convenience. Voss's company had supplied keys and after-hours entry for maintenance work. Holloway and his crew, people who preferred the dark and the anonymity of being useful, had used that access to surveil and transport items and, in the worst cases, people. It wasn't a tidy crime of passion or a single madman. It was a system with a smiling face on the letterhead. The trial was ugly in public. Voss's lawyers were patient surgeons, cutting away allegations and stitching doubt into facts. He denied everything with the practiced calm of men who think denial is armor. Holloway pleaded guilty to several counts and received a sentence that sat in my stomach like both relief and failure. Voss was convicted on charges that could be proved in court: fraudulent use of company resources, conspiracy to facilitate trespass, and a few other clerical crimes that translated into real prison time. The charges we all wanted, the things that would have named a cruelty beyond accounting, were harder to pin to paper. Justice is not a bloodless thing. It's a negotiated one. The city woke up slowly. There were civil suits and settlements and people who took their names off plaques. The mill was condemned and then slowly turned into a memorial garden where the community tried to plant something stronger than fear. Margot organized a night where people read names and candles burned, and we tried to count the things we had lost and the things that returned. Simple meal times, the ability to sit by the river without that particular tightness behind the ribs. For me, the recovery was quieter and longer than any courthouse drama. I went back to work at the warehouse because the rhythm of wood and old brass kept me tethered. I learned to sleep again without imagining shapes at the foot of my bed. I learned to take the long way sometimes because it felt less like hiding and more like choosing what to see. Lucas and Margot kept the rituals of small kindnesses: coffee, a lifted hand at the crossing, and Officer Renee would sometimes come into the shop and joke about the worst patrol stories as if laughter could be therapy. There were nights when the memory returned with the precision of a wind that knows its route. I would wake and see the back room of the mill in a flash and feel like I had been permitted to look at something I shouldn't. But those nights thinned with time as wounds do if tended. The city, too, became less a map of threats and more a map of people who had insisted on living. We didn't forget. Forgetting is for those who haven't been changed. We remembered, and the memory turned into caution and eventually into stories we told each other in the safety of bright shops and honest laughter. Sometimes I walk by the river and see the mill's outline folded into the skyline like a scar that has faded but never entirely gone. I touch the zipper of my jacket, an old reflex, and I think of how fragile our certainties are, how a routine can be rearranged by the deliberate acts of people who see others as objects. But in the end, the thing I carry as proof of survival is not a medal or a headline. It is a simple, stubborn fact. We came back to our streets and we kept living in them. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Aaron Blackwell. I was 29 years old on October 13, 2018, the night that changed everything. If you know Grand Rapids, Michigan, you think of the Riverwalk, the old brick storefronts, the way the city hums in late summer with patios and laughter. You don't think of the corners that go quiet when the streetlights blink out or the buildings that keep their own secrets. I didn't either, not until that October. People remember me as an easygoing guy. I worked nights stocking shelves at a family-run bookstore on Fulton Street, taught a weekly beginner's woodworking class at the community center, and drank terrible coffee on purpose because I liked the bitter. My roommate was Jonah Pierce, a lanky freelance photographer with a permanent film camera slung over his shoulder. He liked to say he photographed things other people walked past. Our landlord, Mrs. Caldwell, was 80 if she was a day and could bake a pie that made the whole hallway smell like Sunday. There are a dozen small-town details like that in my life, and each of them mattered later because they tethered me to a pattern of normalcy I refused to let go of, until I had to. Before that night, my world was ordinary in the most stubborn way. I had a girlfriend for 2 years, Emily Hart, who worked at a clinic uptown and laughed at my corny jokes, a group of friends who met every Tuesday for trivia at O'Leary's, a dog named Rust that belonged to my sister, Kate, but who would follow me like he owned me. I loved the small rituals, the creak in the stairs of our apartment building, the barista who spelled my name wrong with cheerful stubbornness, the way the Perry Marquette River smelled like wet leaves in the fall. These were anchors. The bookstore job kept me late most nights, which meant I knew the quiet side of Grand Rapids, how shadows pooled differently near the old mills, how echoes from an empty alley could sound like a second heartbeat. I often walked home along the river when the moon was thin because it felt safer than the bus stop on Division. On paper, it was sensible. Shorter route, fewer people, better lighting in most sections. In practice, it was a decision I made 1,000 times without thinking, and then once, only once, the city answered me back. There were warning signs, of course. Little things, the way people always notice the small details only after something happens. A van idling at a corner when it shouldn't have been, a neighbor's porch light that blinked erratically for a week, a series of flyers for a missing cat tacked to telephone poles with the same handwriting as a note I later found. But at 29, you assume you can decode any riddle life hands you, and you chalk up the oddness to city life, to an off night or two, to the economy, to the fact that some people stay up longer than others. That autumn was colder than usual. We had early frost in September and the leaves fell like pages torn from a book. My shift ended at midnight on that Saturday. The bookstore closed, I locked the back door, and I texted Jonah I'd be back late. Emily had gone to work an overnight shift and sent me a quick drive safe before she logged on. I pocketed my keys and walked out into the river-scented air. The route I took runs past an old factory that's been converted into lofts and then along a narrow stretch by the river where second-story windows glow like watchful eyes. People often ask me why I didn't take the bus that night. They ask why I didn't call Jonah to come get me or why I didn't walk with someone. There are a dozen rational answers and one blunt one. I wanted the silence. I had been thinking about a woodworking project, a small cedar box I wanted to build for my sister, and I liked the way my mind focused when I walked alone. I remember that as clearly as the smell of the thrifted leather jacket I wore. The nuances of choice are important because they set the scene. They make the story human, not just a list of events. I also want to introduce one more person before the story truly begins. Officer Michael Groves, a patrolman who later became the first face I saw when everything unraveled. He had been on the force for 12 years and carried himself with the fatigued patience of someone who had seen more nights than anyone should have to. You'll meet him again. His patience mattered more than either of us knew that night. By the time I reached the section of the Riverwalk that bent near Washington Avenue, it was just shy of 1 in the morning. There were fewer people than usual. The bars had closed earlier, I think, and the wind carried a distant hum of refrigeration units and a train that never seemed to get any closer. I felt acetone clear and steady, the kind of focus that comes when you're doing something small and ordinary and expect the world to stay ordinary in return. This is where the main story begins. The first thing that wasn't ordinary was the sound. Not the river, not the wind, but a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from the shadowed side of the mill building. At first, I thought someone was moving furniture or a squirrel was having a fight, but the scraping had a cadence that suggested intention, like someone testing a lock repeatedly. I crossed the street because a set of porch lights had gone out and the silence behind them was dense like wool. As I passed an alley, my shoes caught on something thin and yielding. I looked down, and there, half buried in a pile of wet leaves, was a scrap of paper with a single word scribbled hastily. Look. My heart did a tiny, ridiculous lurch, the kind you try to laugh off. Look at what? I picked up the paper. The handwriting matched nothing I'd seen before, a hurried, almost spidery scrawl. For a second, I thought about pocketing it as a curiosity and continuing my walk home. For another second, I thought about turning back to the bookstore and asking if Jonah wanted to come out and scare me for a laugh. And then I heard a noise behind me that was not the river. It was a low, breathy exhale. The kind that before then I would have attributed to a stray cat or a homeless person sleeping under the awning. But the sound was too deliberate, too measured. I turned slowly. The night seemed to hold its breath with me, and the streetlights seemed fainter, as if someone had dimmed them on purpose. What I saw next was the shape of a man. Not a man I recognized, not anyone I knew from around town, standing where the alley opened into shadow. He was tall, but his features were hidden beneath a hood. He did not speak. He simply stood, as if waiting for me to notice that he had been standing there the entire time. That was the last night I ever felt like the city was a place of small comforts. The rest of the hour blurred into a series of sharp images. The sound of my own voice trying to make conversation where there was none, the feel of the paper sweating in my hand, the sudden, terrible clarity that some nights do not end the way you think they will. I wished, like someone reaches for a talisman, for something ordinary to return, for Rust to bark, for Mrs. Caldwell to call up the stairs asking if I needed anything. But the city was quiet, and the man in the hood was not moving away. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I didn't shout. That's what surprises people when I tell them the story. How quiet I stayed at first, like silence could negotiate a better outcome. The hooded man didn't move closer or back away. He simply tilted his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I remember the texture of the paper in my palm, the word look, and how stupid it felt to be holding a clue like a child's tag. I told myself to breathe and to treat it like a harmless late-night encounter, an awkward misread, a prank. The rational part of my brain was a tether I clung to. Everything okay? I called out, trying for a voice that sounded practiced and casual, the kind I used at the bookstore when customers wanted a book on grief or a history title they couldn't quite name. The hooded man didn't answer. He took one step, the movement slow, and for a second I thought he might speak. When he didn't, the step became a threat in my head. I slipped the scrap of paper into my pocket because holding it felt like offering a negotiation. The man remained in the shadows. I started walking, keeping my back toward the more lit side of the street, believing with all the foolish faith of someone who once thought a rant at a town hall could fix the world that my presence would be enough to keep him at bay. He matched my pace. That's when my legs decided they had better things to do than walk beside a stranger in a hood. I cut across the little pedestrian bridge that arches over the river, a shortcut I'd used 100 times. At the far end, the Riverwalk bends and opens into the busier Fulton Street. If I could reach Fulton, I could be near the bookstore again, near people, near the smell of brewed coffee and the warmth of fluorescent lights. I moved faster. He moved faster, too. Panic is a precise thing. It compresses time and stretches details so their edges are serrated. My heart pumped hot under my ribs. I could hear the scrape of his shoes behind me, steady and deliberate. I glanced back and saw the hooded man step out into the lamplight for the first time. He wasn't young. His face was lined and pale, almost waxen, and there was something wrong with his eyes, a slackness like a man who'd been watching one thing for too long. He smiled, and it did not touch his eyes. "Hey!" I barked, to the man or to the night, I can't say. I don't remember whether I dialed 911 or fumbled with my phone like a cartoon. The screen lit, and in the glow I saw the numbers tremble before my fingers found 911. The operator's voice was small but efficient. I told her where I was, gave my name because it felt needed, and tried not to sound like I was inventing a story on the fly. The man heard me talking. He laughed once, a sound that bounced off the brick and the river like someone flipping a coin into a well. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "An officer's on the way." That was the first concrete thing I clung to, the idea that help was coming. The operator asked questions that required simple answers. My location, my description. I heard the rustle of the man's coat. The call took maybe 90 seconds, which in the moment felt like an hour. He closed the distance faster than I expected and lunged, trying to grab my arm. I managed to elbow him away and sprinted, a stupid, panicked run toward the busier part of Fulton. People turned their heads. A couple stepped out of a taco place, phones lighting their faces, and that human reaction gave me hope. The hooded man backed off when others started to notice. For an instant, his face was blank again, like a porcelain mask, and he took a step away into the deeper shadow by the mill. The officer who pulled up 2 minutes later, maybe 5, time is a liar in memory, was Officer Michael Groves. He had the worn patience I mentioned before, and the way he spoke over the radio made my chest unclench in the smallest way. "He's just down by the old mill," I said. My words tumbled. He followed me. Groves moved with the calm of someone who'd practiced this 1,000 times. He asked me to stay put, radioed for backup, and then moved toward the mill with his flashlight cutting across the brick. Jonah showed up a few minutes later because for some reason my text to him had gone through before I called 911. He was half-dressed from a photo shoot and looked like he had been wrenched from sleep. Emily arrived after her shift when she saw my missed call and the operator's number. They both crowded around me with the kind of frozen concern that reads honest on faces you know well. Officer Groves returned alone. He had his hand on his holster, but kept his voice steady. "He's gone," he said. "But we found something." We followed him back down to the edge of the mill. There, half hidden under a loose pallet and a spread of damp straw, lay a small cardboard box. It was open. Inside were several items arranged with terrifying neatness. 3 Polaroid photos, all with faces in them. Strangers? They were strangers, but each had been photographed from close up. A woman whose eyes were closed as if sleeping, an elderly man with a newspaper folded across his chest, a kid with braces and a gap in his teeth. Under the photos was a thin stack of pages, typed and cramped, like a diary someone had tried to make official by printing. My fingers brushed one of the photos, and it felt cold despite the air. On the back of each was the same single word scrawled in that spidery hand: "Watch." Groves took a picture of the box with his phone and called in the find to dispatch. He asked me if I recognized anyone in the photos. I said no, but my mouth tasted like fear and memory. There are faces we don't notice until something forces us to see them. The city suddenly felt like a map of overlapping glances. He asked if I'd like to come down to the station to give a statement. I wanted to refuse in the way people try to refuse a bad surgery, like if you could keep walking, nothing would have to change. But the night had already moved the pieces on the board. Emily held my hand like a physical permission to go. Jonah put a camera into his bag as if photos could collect truth like jarred fireflies. At the station, they asked the same sorts of questions you expect: where you were, what you saw, whether you'd spoken to the man. I told them everything I could remember. Officer Groves listened and scribbled, his pen rustling like wind on dry leaves. He didn't promise answers he couldn't give. Instead, he told me the truth about procedure. They'd run the prints, check the backgrounds on the Polaroids, and circulate the images. The words were formal, but his eyes stayed on mine with something like concern that didn't evaporate into bureaucratic speech. They released me with a case number and a card that had Groves's number on it. "Call me immediately if you see anything," he said. It felt both ordinary and impossible to be handed the small rectangle like a talisman. Outside, the city had rearranged itself into a place that might remember you. That night, I slept poorly. I woke to my phone buzzing half a dozen times with missed calls, texts, and a bulletin from the local neighborhood forum. Someone had posted about an alley camera catching a figure near the mill on the same night. The clip was grainy, but there it was. A tall shape, a hood, a slow shuffle near the bridge. The comments were full of people speculating, and the speculation is always worse than the truth. The next morning, I went back to the Riverwalk. The box remained taped with police evidence markers. Someone had placed a yellow ribbon across the section, and a camera crew had started setting up at the end of Fulton. People walked by and pretended nothing was wrong, because that's how communities survive. But I couldn't pretend. The scrap of paper with "look" that I'd shoved in my pocket had left a damp outline where it met my keys, as if the word had been written on my palm. The photos and the typed pages from the box were being circulated, and they planted seeds of dread in people who'd seen them. Officer Groves called later that day and asked me to come in again. He sounded quieter in a way I recognized. Not less professional, just more human. "We have 2 leads," he said. "One's a name, the other's a place you might want to avoid for a while." He didn't tell me the name over the phone. He told me to come in. I walked to the station, palms sweating, and felt the city's eyes on my back. Whatever came next, the comfortable version of my life was irretrievably changed. The man in the hood had turned a familiar route into an atlas of menace, and every corner felt like a place where the past might reach out and grab you. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. They sat me down in an interview room that smelled like lemon cleaner and old paperwork. Detective Lillian Chase came in with a folder and the sort of eyes that make you speak the truth because lies get heavy under them. Officer Groves was there too, quieter than the last time, and Jonah hovered by the window with his camera bag clenched like a talisman. Lillian opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "There's a name," she said. "Silas Granger. He came up in a missing persons report from 3 years ago, and in a background check after a parole booking. Lived in the Eastern Mills until he disappeared from records. We found him in the network as someone who rented storage units in and out of Grand Rapids. We think he's been moving." She tapped at another page. "He's been in the area before. He has a record for stalking. We think he might be responsible for those Polaroids." Everything in me folded in on itself. A name is a thing that makes a faceless fear human. Saying it out loud made it heavier. They asked me to come with them to a storage facility on the edge of town, a place Jonah and I had shot photos of for a late-night project months ago, a row of metal doors humming under sodium lights. Lillian moved with efficiency. They had a warrant by the time we arrived. They had canvassed and found surveillance footage of a box being loaded, a van with a partial plate. Someone in dispatch had matched handwriting samples from the Polaroids to a notebook they'd found at a pawn shop traced to a vendor who'd sold goods to a man using the name Silas Granger. We walked together through the rows of units like people entering a mouth. The air smelled like oil and dust. Groves and 2 other officers keyed open units until one door clicked and a smell hit us. Old paper, mildew, that metallic tang that sometimes tastes like memory when you've been crying without noticing. Inside the unit was a nest of boxes, labeled by dates. In one, they found a stack of Polaroids nearly identical to the ones from the mill. In another, a pile of folded clothing, a pair of keys with a hospital tag still attached, and a paperback from a library with a late fee sticker bearing a town name I recognized from a missing persons report. The discovery set off a chain. Forensic teams went to work. Jonah took photos with permission. He told me later he kept shaking because the camera felt like a funeral bell. Emily stayed at my side the whole time. the light in her face steady, as if she could hold me together with sheer will. Detective Chase handled details like a surgeon. She worked through records, cross-referenced dates, and within 3 days, they had enough to put out a focused bulletin and to zero in on locations Silas had recently been seen. The man himself, Silas Granger, was arrested 2 nights later in a rented room above a laundromat 3 neighborhoods over. He was quieter in custody than he had been on the Riverwalk. The hood that had made him a shadow became a loose coat folded around a man who seemed surprised anyone had been paying attention. They brought him in with his hands cuffed and his eyes dull as old pennies. He didn't scream or plead. He sat like a man who had been uninterruptedly waiting for an audience. At arraignment, I sat in the gallery and watched him through a window. The judge read charges: stalking, unlawful confinement, a long list that unspooled like a verdict already written. The prosecution had a pile of evidence: photos, typed manifests, witnesses who had seen him loitering near the Riverwalk at odd hours. They had the storage unit inventory and, most damningly, a sequence of messages found on an old phone, short notes he'd drafted to himself that matched the handwriting on the Polaroids. Look, watch, believe. He never claimed a motive that made sense. He muttered about patterns, about the world as a puzzle he was fixing. In interviews, he spoke in a voice that made everything sound inevitable, as if he were rearranging a map into a picture only he could see. The police found names folded in with the photos, addresses cross-referenced with local missing persons reports. Some of the faces were matched to people whose families had been asking for years. When they searched an abandoned farmhouse tied to him, they found a small room with walls papered in clippings, a chair facing a window he'd used like a watch post. It was grotesque and mundane all at once, a fanatic's haphazard shrine. They charged him with as much as they could prove, and the community breathed a temporary, messy sigh of relief. People who had avoided the Riverwalk started to walk there in daylight again. The mill reopened its lights. Our Tuesday trivia group returned to O'Leary's and pretended the world had not nearly caved in. But arrests do not stitch all the cuts. Evidence can be collected and cataloged, but the memory of being watched is a persistence that does not obey procedure. In the weeks that followed, I found myself jittering at small noises. Rust, my sister's dog, would jump at a shadow, and I'd be grateful for the normalcy of it. I joined a support group the community center ran for people affected by stalking and assault, and I learned to name the things that had been nameless in me: hypervigilance, sleep interruption, the way my palms tightened around doorknobs. Detective Chase recommended therapy. Officer Groves checked on me more than protocol required. Jonah brought over prints of the locations he'd shot, and we drank coffee and talked about how to use the images to tell a story that kept the victims' faces from being reduced to spectacle. There were court dates. Silas's trial was a long, cold season of testimony. Families of missing people came forward as the evidence connected names to faces. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man who planned and watched, who documented the lives of people he observed and turned them into trophies. The defense argued insanity. It is a tired script in the theater of criminal law. In the end, the jury took time and then came back with the verdict that felt like a book closing: guilty on a bundle of counts. When the judge read the sentence, I remember thinking it would be the end. Instead, it became another beginning. The start of many small recoveries that do not announce themselves. People placed flowers at the Riverwalk and left notes. The city held a vigil where people lit candles and talked in voices that trembled and then steadied. Officer Groves received a public commendation. He waved the way people do when they want to deflect attention. Detective Chase continued her work, the kind of quiet that never quite leaves her face. For me, the change was private and stubborn. I did not stop walking the Riverwalk. I refused to give it to fear entirely, but I learned routes that kept me near lights and people. I traded midnight shifts for earlier ones at the bookstore and spent Sundays teaching a different woodworking project to a different set of beginners. I still think about the faces in those Polaroids. Some were matched to families who found answers. Some remain a question that the system could not close. That uncertainty is a kind of companion now. Time does what it can. 2 years later, Jonah's photography series on the Riverwalk and the aftermath was displayed at a small gallery downtown. He dedicated the show to the people who had been watched without consent. Emily and I got engaged quietly at a winter market under a string of bulbs that made everything look like it belonged in a photograph. Detective Chase retired 2 years later and moved to a small lake town. She sent a postcard that said, simply, "Keep watching out for each other." The scar never fully fades. On some nights, I still feel watched, not by Silas, who is behind bars, but by the memory of him, which clings like cobwebs to certain corners. I sometimes turn back on the bridge and count the lights, making sure they're all lit, making sure no one is crouched in shadow. The city has healed in ways that matter. It has also kept a ledger of what it cost to get there. I learned to live with the ledger. If there is a lesson, it is not a neat one. The world is porous. Ordinary choices can have strange consequences. Community matters. Neighbors who noticed, Jonah who came, Emily who stayed, Officer Groves who drove down into the night, Detective Chase who followed the paper trail. They are the threads that kept me from being another photograph in a box. Not everything turns tidy. Not every blank space is filled. But we can gather, and we can fix what we can. And in the gathering, we find reasons to keep walking. This is the last night I tell you about that October and the months after, the way a city rearranges when someone pulls at the seams. The man who followed me is behind bars, families found partial answers, a small Riverwalk is fuller now. I am still Aaron Blackwell. I still make cedar boxes and teach woodworking. The gap he left in me is a certain kind of silence that I honor by making noise where it matters, by speaking, by telling, by watching for the people who pass me by. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 34 when it happened. The date was October 14, 2019. And I still hear the scrape of that one old hinge in my head some nights. If you want the truth, the kind that sits heavy in your chest when the lights go out, you should know the people who surrounded me first. You should know the neighborhood, the petty arguments, the small kindnesses that made the terrible thing feel, for a while, almost ordinary. I lived on Brookfield Drive, a narrow street of maples and clapboard houses on the east side of Grand Rapids. The city wasn't exactly small, but that part of town had the sleepy feel of somewhere everybody knew everybody else's dog's name. Across from my house was a neat bungalow where Mrs. Callahan kept a garden and a radio tuned to old country. Down the block was a battered red pickup that belonged to my friend Lucas Hale. Lucas's family had roots in Forest Hills, and he'd been my neighbor since we were kids throwing sticks into the creek. Lucas is the kind of man who laughs too loud at bad jokes and carries a pocket knife for no sensible reason. He was the first person I called after the hinge scrape became a sound I couldn't ignore. I worked at a small nonprofit downtown, managing events, answering emails, carrying too much responsibility for not enough pay. My boss, Valerie Cross, was practical and sharp. She ran a tight ship and had a way of making complicated things look uncomplicated. At the time, I was in a relationship with a woman named Jenna Whitcomb, who loved to paint and to leave half-finished canvases on our living room couch. Jenna had an easy laugh and an appetite for midnight walks. She could make a storm feel like an excuse for hot chocolate rather than a reason to be afraid. The ordinary people in my life were the kind of people who make a true story believable, because the terrifying doesn't usually arrive alone. It arrives alongside laundry baskets and grocery lists and the ordinary bickering about who left the garage light on. Before that October night, there were smaller signals that something in my life was fraying. My landlord, Mr. Watkins, had been late fixing the porch light for weeks. The city had a construction project on Riverside that made my commute unpredictable, and the trees up and down Brookfield were beginning to turn. News from the region, petty crime reports, a few break-ins in neighboring suburbs, started to float into conversation at the coffee shop. Nothing that should have made me lock my doors and never step outside, just the kind of things you shrug at and then forget. People who know me would tell you I was responsible, reliable about the mortgage, the kind of person old friends called to help move a sofa at dawn. Maybe that's why what came next felt like a betrayal. The world I trusted rearranged itself into something close enough to normal to be convincing, but wrong in a way that made your bones ache. You'll hear a lot of storytellers start with the moment of terror. I don't. I want you to understand how finely balanced my life was, because the ordinary parts made the extraordinary feel like an intruder in my own house. There's also the small human cast of characters who matter. Mrs. Callahan with her rhubarb pie, Lucas with his pocket knife, Jenna painting late into the night while I read on the couch. There was Officer Mia Lang from the Grand Rapids Police Department, who had a soft voice and a no-nonsense way of writing incident reports. Sheriff Brennan, bigger, older, with a hand that smelled of coffee and at least 3 decades on the force, would show up later like a presence from an older town, carrying the kind of certainty that doesn't always translate to the modern world of courtrooms and smartphones. I want you to feel the setting. If you've never been to Grand Rapids in the fall, picture low-hung clouds and a light that seems reluctant to land. Picture the river cutting through the city like an old scar, and the parks where people walked their dogs and watched leaves go by. My house was a modest 2-story with a porch swing that squeaked rhythmically whenever the wind got playful. It was that porch swing that made me feel safe. I'd sit there with a beer and watch the street, and whatever ordinary drama the neighborhood produced would float past like laundry on a line. People often ask me why we stayed. Why didn't we move? Why didn't I call someone sooner? Why didn't I change the locks when I had the chance? The honest answer is the usual one. Inertia and the human hope that things will fix themselves, that tomorrow will be less weird than today. Jenna and I had plans. Small ones, like repainting the bedroom and finally getting that shelf up in the study. Lucas was planning a fishing trip. Mrs. Callahan was planning another batch of pies. Life kept us anchored. There were also the little mysteries. Missing mail that turned up days later. A shadow at the edge of the backyard that I rationalized as a raccoon. Those details, when you put them together later, make a breadcrumb trail. But in the moment, they were just details. The kind a polite adult shrugs at and files away under odd. My mother would have told me to trust my instincts. My friends told me I was exaggerating. That's another funny thing about real fear. It so often arrives in a way that makes you ridiculous to the people you love. I'll tell you the truth now, the way it unfolded, step by step, because the human mind prefers sequence. There was no single scream that changed everything. There were small calibrations, a turning of the screws. On the afternoon of October 14th, I had run errands, met with Valerie about an upcoming fundraiser, and come home to find the porch light blinking like it had been hit by a gust of wind. I fixed it, or at least I thought I did. Jenna was at a gallery opening downtown, and Lucas had texted that he'd be around later to help me move an awkward bookcase. At about 9:30, I remember making another cup of coffee and hearing, faint and intermittent, the scrape of metal from the back of the house. You won't believe this next part until you hear it. For the first 700 words of this story, I've been setting the stage because terror tastes different if you know who the players are. You need to care about the little things because they give weight to the big ones. So here, because you're ready now, is how the night turned. The scrape started again, sharper, like a long fingernail tracing a seam. It seemed to come from the alley behind my garage, a place where the hedges made a wall and the moon found it hard to shine. I froze with the mug halfway to my lips. The house was quiet except for the hum of our old fridge, the distant hum of traffic somewhere across town. I told myself raccoon, wind, a neighbor's toolbox. I told myself a lot of things. Then I heard a second sound, a muffled footfall, careful and slow, as if someone aware of the difference between noise and silence was choosing their steps like a thief in church. I tiptoed to the back door, pressed my ear to the cold wood, and listened. There was a breathy hiss, a voice near the hedge, whispering something I couldn't catch. My first instinct was to call Lucas. My second instinct was to check the kitchen for anything I could use for protection. I reached for the phone. The battery read 42%. Jenna's call wouldn't go through. There was no answer. The porch swing groaned in the wind, and for the first time in my life, a normal object felt malevolent. I pushed the door open. It was only a crack, but the nook of the backyard was darker than it should have been. The moon was behind clouds. And then And this is where ordinary life stops being enough to explain what you saw. I saw the prints, not animal tracks. Shoe prints, 4 of them, leading from the fence to the side of the garage, then stopping as if the footsteps had decided to hover in mid-decision. I keep trying to find the right word for how the world felt at that moment. Hovering is the closest thing, not quite moving forward, not quite withdrawing. The rest of what happened that night is the part you came here for. But before I tell you, remember the names and the faces. Remember Lucas's loud laugh, Mrs. Callahan's rhubarb pie, Jenna's paint-splattered jeans. Remember that I was 34, that the date was October 14th, 2019, and that I had no idea the hinge scrape was about to become the sound that divided my life into before and after. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I told Lucas to stay in his truck until I could see him without the porch light giving everything away. He cursed at me for being paranoid. The old laugh, the knife in his pocket, but he kept to his promise. I eased the back gate open and stepped into the alley with a flashlight that felt too weak for what I wanted to illuminate. The prints were there in the packed earth, at first clear, then blurred, as if someone had knelt and dragged their feet on purpose. They stopped at the side of the garage where the old metal hinge on the back door had been twisted enough to make that terrible, long scrape. I crouched and studied the marks. They were from a boot, heavy tread, size maybe 12. That freaked me because I've always had clumsy feet and wear a size 9. Whoever had been here was larger than me, or they wanted me to think that. Beside the prints, something small lay half buried in the mulch, a scrap of paper, folded neatly like someone had a sense of ceremony about leaving it. My hands shook when I picked it up. "We were watching," it read in a blunt, blocky hand. My throat closed. I wanted to laugh, to tell myself it was a teenager trying to be edgy, but the handwriting was too steady for a prank, and whoever had placed it there had done so with calculation. I looked up and found Lucas's face in the darkness a few feet away. He wasn't laughing now. He was the kind of man who understood danger before anyone else called it that by name. We called the police. Officer Mia Lang arrived with a flashlight that held a small sun, a uniform that smelled faintly of rain, and a notebook that made her look like the kind of person who would notice the shape of a cloud if it meant solving a problem. She moved without fuss, took pictures, asked me the usual questions, the way someone reading a form out loud would. Had I seen anyone? Had anything been stolen? Did I have security cameras? I told her about the hinge scrape and the shoe prints and the scrap of paper. She took the scrap and photographed the prints. Sheriff Brennan showed up 15 minutes later, larger in presence and slow with his words, as if he thought the right sentence should be chosen and weighed. They searched the perimeter. No footprints beyond the stop at the garage. No sign of a ladder or a vehicle. Mia frowned at a smear on the garage door, as if someone had tried to wipe off fingerprints with a gloved hand and smudged instead. She dusted for prints where she could and said, matter-of-factly, that sometimes people trespass and then run when they realize someone is home. That didn't fit the scrap of paper or the way the prints had been left. Tessellated, intentional things rarely belong to random kids. After the police left, no arrest, no overnight patrol assigned, Lucas insisted on spending the night on my couch. "You're not staying here alone," he said, the kind of sentence that removes the choice. Jenna was still at the gallery. She'd texted earlier that she'd be late, and when I tried calling her now, the phone went straight to voicemail. Her car was in the driveway, which meant she was either here already hidden somewhere, unlikely, or she was delayed and her keys were sitting on the hook by the back door where she always left them. The thought of someone in the house while her car warmed in the driveway thrummed through me like a second heartbeat. We sat awkwardly in the living room under a single lamp, the paint on the ceiling performing the same tired patterns it had before this night. Lucas hummed under his breath, a nervous tune he used when he was thinking. We tried to make jokes about raccoons and teenagers and bored vandals. The room laughed with us politely and then fell silent again, because the world outside had a sound now that couldn't be undone. That hinge scrape began to replay in my mind like a warped record. It was midnight when Lucas said he'd check the back again. I argued, loud enough to be petulant, and He told me to grow up and stop pretending the world was a television show where all threats are solved in 42 minutes. He left, and I heard the screen door creak across the yard and then silence. Later, I'd find that silence heavier than any noise. When he came back, he was quieter than usual. He sat on the couch, hands folded, and told me what he'd seen. Near the garage, where the print stopped, was a small hole in the foundation covered by a loose slab of concrete. Someone had dug shallowly, lifted the slab, and replaced it so barely that it didn't register at first glance. Beneath it, in the dirt, were 3 items: a tarnished copper washer, a child's marble with a hairline fracture, and a small brass key with no obvious lock to match it. Maybe they were dropping bait, Lucas said. Maybe it's nothing. But there was a weight to the way he put his hands on the key, like it tasted wrong. I held it too, and it was cold and had the kind of indentation on the bow that suggested it had been carried on a keyring for years, scratched with other lives. The washer was stamped with a faint number. The marble still had sand in the crack. Whoever had placed these things under the slab had done so with intention, like a ritual you'd see in some backwoods story, not in a residential neighborhood. My mind wanted to slide into explanations that involved teenagers and dares. It wanted the mundane answer. The house was not interested in being mundane tonight. We found more later, a smear on Jenna's easel. Not paint, but something darker. And a small footprint in the upstairs laundry room where no one should have been walking. Officer Mia came back with a canine who nosed around and then wagged his tail, uninterested. Dogs have a way of sussing out whether something smells like ordinary trouble or the human kind of menace. Mia told me not to walk the neighborhood alone, suggested I consider a temporary stay elsewhere, and said she'd increase patrols if I gave permission. I said yes to everything because saying no felt like admitting I was giving up. Around 2 a.m, my phone chirped with a text. It was Jenna. I'm on my way home. I exhaled. Relief uncoiled like steam, and I told Lucas, who pretended not to care, and then checked the windows as if he believed a watchman was required. The text's timestamp made me blink. It was sent at 2:07 a.m., 4 minutes earlier. That was impossible. The text appeared now. My thumb hovered over her name and then dialed. The call went to an answering machine that didn't sound like Jenna. There was no background noise, no clink of a glass, no gallery chatter. When Jenna finally walked in, minutes later, with paint on her cardigan and a smoky perfume that always made me think of rain, her face was pale, and she smelled of the street, not the gallery. She hugged me too tightly and then sat and told us about the opening. She laughed at our worry and said she'd seen someone on the sidewalk who had walked too close to her, had a presence that felt like a shadow, but she'd waved it off. She said she'd texted me as soon as she got in the car, which didn't tie to the timestamp on my phone, and she reached for her keys on the hook. The hook was empty. She swore it had been there before she left. We chalked it up to fatigue and to phones that lie sometimes. Lucas left for the night after promising to check the doors and call if anything moved. We locked and double-locked and slid the bolt in place and sat in the living room as night settled like a hand over the city. I tried to sleep and failed. My mind replayed the terse message tucked into the mulch, the key under the slab, Jenna's missing key, the prints that stopped like someone had decided to vanish. At 3:08 in the morning, the hinge scrape returned, but this time it wasn't distant. It was precise, as if someone was testing the old metal back door. Then a knock, deliberate and measured, 3 short, then a long pause, then another 3 short. It was a pattern I recognized only because I'd once heard it on a documentary about old knocks used by tradesmen. Somebody was at the back door, and they weren't trying to hide it. They were announcing themselves. My heart hammered so loud I thought the whole house could hear it. I stood, and Jenna reached out as if to hold me back, her fingers shaking. I moved toward the door, 1 foot after another, every step louder than the last. The knob was cold beneath my hand. When I opened the door, the alley was empty. No shadow slipping away, no tall boots retreating. The hinge scrape had stopped. On the step, damp from the night, sat a single object, a small, clean stone painted black with a white circle in the center like an eye. I picked it up and felt the paint flake against my skin. There was something else beneath the stone, tucked into the mortar like a note. I unfolded it with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Inside was a single word written in the same blunt hand as the scrap that started this whole thing. Soon. The night swallowed that word and left us to hold it like a hot coal. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When Mia came back, this time with 2 other officers and a slow, methodical look that made me breathe out just a little, the house felt smaller, as if it had been folded in on itself. She photographed the stone, the note, the spot where the slab had been lifted. Sheriff Brennan hummed and asked questions with the patience of a man who had learned there were no good answers for a neighborhood full of frightened people. Lucas stood by the window, watching the street like a man who'd been taught to expect violence from television and now suspected it from real life. Mia said they'd put extra patrols on the block and that a detective would follow up. She warned me not to touch anything else and recommended a home security camera if I could swing it. Sometimes a presence likes being noticed, she said quietly, and it sounded less like advice and more like a report. I made tea that tasted like metal and sat on the couch while Jenna walked around the living room like she was trying on a new fear. The morning after the soon stone arrived felt thin. The sky in the kind of gray that pretends to be gentle and is not. I called in sick to the office. Valerie understood but asked for details, which I couldn't give without sounding hysterical. And Lucas suggested we go to the hardware store for cameras. If someone's out there thinking this is a game, he said, voice hard, we'll make it boring for them. At the store, we bought a pair of battery-operated cameras with motion sensors and an app that promised cloud backups and instant alerts. The salesman was nervous in the way of people who sense someone else's misery but don't know how to fix it. You might want the one with the floodlight, he said, and I thought about that hinge scrape and decided floodlight might be a good thing to own. We mounted one camera on the back of the garage, angled toward the alley where the prints had stopped, and another by the front porch, low enough to catch someone's face if they leaned down. Setting them up felt like making a promise. If the world recorded what was happening, perhaps it would behave like a civilized thing and explain itself. The first footage we collected was disappointing. A raccoon knocked over a trash can at 2:14 a.m., Mrs. Callahan's dog padded across the lawn at 6:03 a.m., and a jogger waved at the camera and smirked when his reflection startled him in the lens. I went to sleep with my phone set to buzz at the slightest change. Around 11 that night, Jenna began to paint. The canvas she had been working on all month, which had started as a sunrise and turned into a nightscape, had a new addition, a single small white circle surrounded by a ring of black. She painted it with careful, almost tender strokes that made my throat constrict. It looked like an eye, she said without looking up. A literal eye in my head last night when I closed mine. I had to get it out. Her hand was steady. The circle was perfect, unnaturally so. I asked her about the stone and the note, and she told me she hadn't seen anything in the alley on her way home, that her keys had been in her pocket when she left the gallery. She said the text she'd sent at 2:07 a.m. must have been delayed, like messages sometimes were. I wanted to believe her because love and reason are greedy things that want easy explanations. At 3:03 a.m., the front camera registered motion. The notification woke me like an alarm, cold and precise. The video showed our porch empty, and then for a single second, a darker outline that looked like a man bending over to pick something up. The figure moved with a strange, angular motion, not quite human, not quite a trick of the light, and then it was gone. The timestamp read 3:03:01, and the file corrupted for 3 seconds. When the video resumed, there was a smear on the step, a child's crayon drawing of an eye, black surrounded by jagged white, the kind of crude picture you make to prove a point. The drawing was there, and the stone had been moved a few inches closer to the door. We called Mia. She came anyway, flashlight bobbing, breath visible in the cold night air. She took the drawing and the stone and suggested that perhaps kids were bored in the neighborhood or pranksters looking for reaction. Maybe it was that simple. Maybe it wasn't. The way she said it left both options alive. That same night later, while I tried to sleep in the study with the radio on low, my phone lit up with a video message from an unknown number. I expected nothing and got the worst kind of proof. It was footage taken from a low angle outside my back door. In the darkness, a person moved into view, not toward the camera, but sideways, as though searching for a place to stand. The angle was poor, the face partly hidden, but the hands were visible, pale, calloused, and in the last second of the clip, one of them reached out and pressed something against the camera lens. The image flashed, black paint, then a white ring, then the feed cut to static. The timestamp showed the recording had been made at 3:02 a.m. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. The phone chimed again. This time text, "Look closer." Jenna didn't understand why I was pacing. She put a mug of tea on the side table and watched me as if she were trying to decide whether to enter a foreign country. "Maybe we should go," she said finally. "Maybe you should stay with Lucas for a few days." Lucas refused to be bitted away. "No," he said. "You're not leaving him." He sounded like a man who'd made his choice and would live with the consequences. "We need to find who's doing this. Cameras, get footage from neighbors, find patterns." We did. A neighbor 2 houses down, a teacher named Elias Finch, checked the Ring camera on his porch and found 3 seconds of garbage bags moving by themselves at 2:58 a.m., and then a shadow that lingered just off camera at 3:03 a.m. Mrs. Callahan swore she'd seen someone standing at the corner of our street at dusk the night before, watching houses like they were choosing which one to own. "He had an eye patch," she said, and we all laughed nervously until no one could find any humor in it. The following morning, Jenna's phone alerted me to an item I hadn't noticed, a screenshot she'd taken at 3:07 a.m. while half asleep. In the picture, her hand trembles as she holds the same black painted stone between her fingers. On her wrist is a small smear of something dark. She didn't remember taking the photo. She didn't remember stepping outside. She didn't remember the 15 minutes that were missing from her night. The missing time was a hole in the fabric of my life. I checked her pockets, the car, her paintbrushes. There was no record of steps beyond those 15 minutes. No credit card transactions, no surveillance, nothing except the screenshot and the smear on her wrist that looked suspiciously like the same black paint as the stone. That afternoon, Mrs. Callahan knocked on the door with flour on her hands and fear in her voice. "I wanted to tell you," she said, seated at our kitchen table like someone confessing a sin. "There's a story my mother used to tell about a man who watches houses. They used to call him the Watcher. He'd leave things, stones, notes, like a collector. Never hurt anyone," my mother said, "but he took something important. Time, peace." She paused and added, "It sounds ridiculous, but when I found that little circle carved into my fence this morning, I thought I should tell you." We all looked at the fence and found, small and neat as carved in pencil, a white ring surrounded by a black crescent. It had been there for less than 12 hours. The house, our house, was being marked. The neighborhood had become a map, and someone was drawing the route. That night, Jenna slept downstairs on the couch while I lay awake staring at the ceiling. At 2:56 a.m., my phone buzzed. A new video message. Jenna's hands were in it, filmed from a point-of-view camera I'd never seen. The camera followed her feet as she walked out the front door, barefoot on cold grass, heading toward the alley. Her voice, barely audible, whispered, "He said it was time." The video ended with a shot of her wrist, where a tiny black circle had been painted. I sprinted outside and found her standing by the hedge, eyes unfocused, the painted stone in her hand like a talisman. She didn't speak. She didn't resist when I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her inside. Her lips were chapped and her cheeks pale. She put the stone in my palm and whispered, "I don't know what he wanted." We called Mia. She came and took statements and looked at the footage and at Jenna and then finally at me. Her expression was a mix of professional concern and something that looked like pity. "We'll get you in touch with a detective," she said. "There are patterns to stalking that local units are better at handling." There was another sound then, a distant park fountain, a dog barking, ordinary noises trying to drown out the new currents under the city. I held the stone like a pressure point against my ribs and wondered how a house could be hollowed out from the inside without anyone's knowledge, how a person could sleepwalk into danger because someone else had decided to wake them. At dawn, Jenna curled into a ball on the couch, exhausted and apologetic. I watched her sleep and felt the line between before and after sharpen into a blade. The watcher, the notes, the stones, they had not escalated to violence, not yet. They had instead stolen the night and sown doubt. They'd taken our sleep and replaced it with anticipation. And anticipation, I'd learned, can be as precisely cruel as any blow. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The detective who finally made sense of the mess was Detective Marla Voss, a woman in her mid-40s with a no-nonsense ponytail and a way of asking questions that made small lies fall out like loose teeth. She didn't come with the dramatic flourish of TV detectives. She came with spreadsheets, subpoenas, and a patience that smelled like paperwork. She sat in my living room with a thermal printout of the camera footage, the scrap of paper, the little brass key, and the photos Mia had taken, and she laid them out like puzzle pieces. "We're looking for pattern and access," she said, plain as bread. "Who knows your schedule? Who would notice the porch light out? Who's been at the house more than they should?" She asked me, Jenna, Lucas, even Mrs. Callahan, the same questions until the neighborhoods of our lives were mapped. Morning runs, trash days, someone else's delivery schedule. From the people who'd been nearby, she collected alibis. From the things left at our door, she collected hypotheses. She pushed on the edges until the center, the brass key, gave something up. "Stamped number," she said, holding the key up to a light. "Government keys. Storage, maintenance lockers, someone who accessed municipal property or worked in building maintenance." She made a few calls and 3 days later came back with a name that sounded like someone from another kind of story. Gideon Price. He'd worked as a contractor in and out of the municipal jobs, did odd jobs in neighborhoods that needed cheap hands, and had a record for trespassing and petty theft 20 years ago. Marla said the record didn't always predict the present, but it gave them a place to look. They tracked Gideon to a storage facility on the edge of town. The surveillance there, a dull blinking camera on a beige wall, gave them a man with an uneven gait and a jacket with paint under the cuffs. Mrs. Callahan's offhand memory of an eye patch lined up like a brittle coincidence when the staff at the facility mentioned an old injury to his face. The washer number matched a locker he'd rented 6 months earlier under a different name. He fits the profile, and the lock on that locker rattled excused into place like fate. When Marla's team raided the locker, it was like opening a private museum of obsession. Inside were boxes of stones painted black and white, stacks of notes folded exactly the way the one in my mulch had been folded, and a small, crude journal in which Gideon had written with awful, careful sincerity. The entries spoke of nights spent watching porches, of learning the rhythms between houses, of wanting to collect the calm of people who'd slept while his life had fallen apart. There were sketches of eyes, lists of houses with small black rings beside some of the addresses, and a page with my street scrawled with particular care. They found the washer stamped with the same number as the one beneath the slab at my garage. They found the key, and they found a traffic camera clip showing Gideon near our street the night the first scrap appeared. They brought him in. In interrogation, Gideon was small and placid in a way that made my skin crawl. He didn't yell or plead. He spoke like someone reciting the same words until they were only shapes. "They sleep," he said when Marla asked what he'd done. "They don't see. They don't notice. I wanted them to feel the watching so they'd know. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about being seen." The motive was messy and human. A man whose family had slipped away in a truck accident years before, whose despair had calcified into ritual. Not every monster has a theatrical reason. Some of them are ledger books and small grievances grown into superstition. Gideon had painted stones and placed them like breadcrumbs to remind people there was an outside force keeping track. He admitted to leaving notes and arranging the items under slabs to painting black rings on fences. He said he never intended to cut sleep into pieces or to make people act against their will. But he also admitted in a voice like glass that sometimes he watched people and waited for them to fall asleep, because sleep is where people are most honest. He didn't explain the gaps in Jenna's night or the video messages, and those details remained in the gray between confession and truth. He was arrested for trespassing, for possession of stolen property, and for actions that, in court, were explained as harassment and intimidation. The trial was quiet compared to the storm it had been in my head. Gideon didn't fight the charges hard. The evidence was patterned like a path to his locker. He pleaded guilty to several counts. The judge gave him a sentence that balanced punishment with mandated counseling. The legal system's attempt to put a bandage on something deeper than law can touch. After the arrest, there was a period that felt like being let out of a room that had been tilted. Patrols did increase. The cameras I'd put up recorded people walking by without lingering shadows. The painted stones stopped appearing on porches. Gideon's journal and the evidence were used to show the pattern that had haunted us. Officer Mia sat with us afterward and told us gently that people are often stopped by the law when someone else has the strength to make a report and the patience to follow through. It was her quiet insistence that had kept the thread from fraying entirely. Recovery wasn't cinematic. It was a slow, domestic thing, replacing the back door hinge, drilling new locks, and buying shades that closed tight. Jenna painted the wall where the black ring had been, and for the first time in months, she painted a sunrise that actually looked like dawn instead of a warning. We went to counseling separately and together. I stopped sleeping with the porch light off. I learned how to set boundaries and how to answer the knock without opening the door, how to call a neighbor and ask them to check on me. Lucas kept his pocket knife for projects and refused to let the house feel like a fragile thing. People asked if I still heard the hinge scrape. Sometimes in the quiet hours, my brain would produce the sound like an old radio finding its station. But the scrape began to lose its authority. It became a memory of a noise rather than the herald of danger. The scrap of paper that said "we were watching" became a strange relic on our kitchen table for a while, a talisman for the fact that attention can be weaponized. We burned most of Gideon's stones under the supervision of an officer who wanted them cataloged for evidence. The ashes smelled like paint and the end of an era. There was one last thing. At the sentencing, a woman, small and plain, stood and said she had known Gideon years ago and that he'd once been kind. The judge nodded. The news ran a short segment on the case, and for a while Grand Rapids had a neat story about how a neighborhood came together and an odd man with an eye patch was stopped. People thanked us. Mrs. Callahan sent over pies. Life did not snap back into the exact shape it had been, but the edges smoothed. Time does strange things after terror. It both erodes and preserves. I learned as much about the fragility of feeling safe as I did about the stubbornness of community. Jenna and I decided to move to a quieter street 3 boroughs over the following spring. The house on Brookfield felt too saturated with the memory. We kept the porch swing and painted the bedroom a calm green that made both of us breathe easier. Lucas built a new shelf in the study with the brass key placed in a locked box. A reminder of what had been and what had been stopped. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a hinge in my head, a ghost of something that happened years ago. And I remember that fear is not a thing to be defeated, but a condition to be managed. We met our watchers with light and with law, with cameras, and with people who were willing to notice. That is the true, small heroism of ordinary life. Neighbors who answer the phone, officers who come back at night, friends who refuse to leave you alone on a couch. Thank you for listening to what happened to me on Brookfield Drive. If this story has a lesson, it is that small things matter. A scrap of paper, a painted stone, a neighbor's memory. They are the clues that keep us safer than we imagine. It took months for my sleep to feel whole again. It took a sentence in court and an apology I didn't need from him to reconcile the loss of my innocence. In the end, the terrifying thing that happened in Grand Rapids became, as terrifying things do, something we speak about on winter nights like a warning and a promise. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jacob Hale. I'm 32 years old, and the night I'm about to tell you about happened on October 12th, 2018. I tell this as a man who prefers the rational world, spreadsheets, steady paychecks, reliable coffee, because admitting what I saw feels like a betrayal of that safer life. But it's true. Every detail sears itself into memory the way frost marks a car window in the morning. Crisp, impossible to smooth away. Before I go on, I want you to know who I was then, who the people were around me, and where we lived. because the ordinary bones of life made the terror that followed feel like an infection in healthy tissue. I lived in a narrow two-story brick house on Willow Bend Avenue in a neighborhood most people in Grand Rapids called Northbridge. It had a small porch and a maple tree that went gold in October. My job as a data analyst at a small logistics firm kept me indoors in the quiet hum of computers. And on most evenings, I cooked dinner, watered the spider plant on the windowsill, and read old crime novels until the streetlights came on. My closest friend was Mason Boone, tall, quick-witted former college teammate who'd moved back to Grand Rapids after 4 years away. He rented a unit 2 doors down and had the kind of laugh that could convince you anything would be fine. There was Lila Grant, who ran the coffee shop on Easton Street and seemed to know every human living within a 3-block radius. She brewed with surgical patience and handed out advice with the same steady hand. She, more than anyone, tried to coax jokes out of the neighborhood when worries crept in. Then there was Theo Brooks, the city maintenance foreman, the kind of practical man people trusted with heavy things, snowplows, old elm trees, municipal secrets. He and Mason came from the same pine-scented small town outside Grand Rapids and liked to reminisce about the river runs behind the old paper mill. Names like Bethany Cross, Reverend Holden, and Officer Raymond Holt floated through my life, each one ordinary, human, and painfully alive in the small community we shared. The place itself, Grand Rapids, is the sort of American city that smells faintly of brewing hops and rain. Streets that run true and perpendicular, the river cutting a sober line through downtown, and neighborhoods with porches where people waved at one another without pretending not to. It's not a place people expect to be menaced by anything beyond late shifts, traffic, and the occasional violent thunderstorm, which was exactly why nothing prepared me for the night in question. Leading up to October 12th, life had been a jam of small stresses. We'd had an early fall rain that washed the leaves down and made the city shine. The news ran stories about city council meetings and a water main project near Brighton Docks. There were whispers about development and old warehouses being converted to lofts. Some people hoped for gentrification. Others braced for the rent hikes that would follow. Mason and I had been talking about a fishing trip to Muskegon the following weekend, trying to pretend that normal plans could hold back whatever unnamed anxiety hums at the edges of being an adult. I had noticed a week before the incident that the streetlights on Willow Bend, 2 blocks north of my house, flickered oddly. One steady, one trembling, one dark. I hadn't thought much of it. Strange things happen in cities. Cables wear out, birds nest. But sometimes when light fails in patterns, it feels like an animal clearing its throat. Theo mentioned the failing grid when we crossed paths at the hardware store. He promised a crew would check the poles next Tuesday. That promise was the sort of small municipal reassurance that lets people sleep. People in the neighborhood had also started talking about an abandoned factory near Heritage Hill, the old Franklin and Sons building, a hulking brick thing with broken windows and ivy like gray hair. Teenagers took dares there. Dog walkers skirted the property at night. Lila insisted they leave the stray cats alone. Mason joked about trespassing and finding treasure. I went past it once on a run, its silhouette a castle cut into the dim sky, and thought about all the lives that had ended up inside its rusted machinery. But this old building to us was background, a figure in a collage. There were subtle changes in the days before October 12th that, in hindsight, read like the first spread of a storm map. My neighbor, Elaine, who kept roses on her porch and baked lemon tarts for block parties, stopped sitting on her stoop. She told me, flippantly, that her house felt colder even in the afternoon, as if the heat had failed. We joked it was age of the structure, drafty windows. She laughed in the way people do when they are trying to keep worry at bay. A report on the local online forum about missing tools from the municipal shed circulated for a day and then vanished. No big theft, a commenter wrote. Another neighbor mentioned a man who had been seen walking late at night around the Franklin and Sons lot, carrying a flashlight and a duffel bag. People speculated about artists, squatters, or a homeless man. We didn't treat it as anything to do with us. On the evening itself, I had been at my desk longer than usual, chasing a data discrepancy that would roll into my Thursday morning meeting. Mason texted that he'd stop by with pizza. Lila closed her shop at 7:30 p.m. and invited us to pop in for a cup before she locked up. We declined, the way friends decline when they want to be polite but are secretly tired. At 9 p.m., the world outside smelled of damp leaves and that particular ozone that comes just before heavy rain. I remember folding my Tuesday shirt and thinking about the triviality of that action. Ironed, folded shirts as if neatness could fend off chaos. My phone buzzed. Mason's text, "On my way. Be there in 10." By then, the prelude had finished. The neighborhood noises thinned. People behind curtains, TV glow in windows, the rustle of a dog in another block. The streetlight down the block, the one that had been flickering, went out completely. I noticed it, but didn't say it out loud. We were all guilty in our way of choosing not to name the small misgivings. Naming them seemed to invite them to grow. At roughly 9:22 p.m., a sound cut through the hush. Not a vehicle, not human speech, but something deeper. A metallic thump that echoed like an old machine sighing. It came from the direction of the Franklin and Sons building. I paused mid-fold, listening. Mason arrived, dropping the pizza box on my kitchen table, asking if I'd heard it too. He had that look, the half-smile of someone ready to write the sound off. "Probably a loose sheet of metal in the wind," he said. "Old buildings make theater noises." I should have believed him. For 70 minutes, we could have believed him. That's the terrible thing. Ordinary explanations were easy, comforting. They kept the monster small and manageable in our minds. But truth is fussy. It doesn't like neat little reasons. When something wants to announce itself, it finds a way. At 9:31 p.m., the main story began. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The metallic thump uncoiled into a rhythm. 2 slow knocks, then a pause, then a long, dragging scrape that sounded almost like someone drawing a nail along a chalkboard, the length of the Franklin and Sons building. And the easy shrug that had been our first defense slid off like a coat in the rain. We both heard it then, a low humming under the scrape, a vibration that seemed to set the teeth in my jaw to ringing. "We should check it out?" Mason said, the grin gone. He was the kind of friend who turned up when things were mildly risky, the sort of person who believed in proving a fear wrong by walking into it. I felt foolish for wanting to say no, for wanting instead to call Officer Holt, to sit under the porch light with the spider plant and let the city eat the night. But the same thing that pushes a man to peek into a shadow propelled me toward the door. We left my house quietly, no punctuation of lights, moving like burglars, stealing a neighborhood back from the dark. The maple tree's leaves whispered above us. The street was a ribbon of near black. At the corner, a single police cruiser idled with its interior light on, Officer Holt, as it turned out, filling out a report about a loose manhole cover on Kenwood. He waved when he saw us, calling over, "You boys okay?" I lied, "Yeah, just heard something." He nodded as if we'd all heard it. That nod, casual, professional, felt like an accord, an unspoken agreement. Investigate, but don't panic. We moved toward Franklin and Sons along the sidewalk that skirted the river, its dark water reflecting nothing. The building sat like a heart abandoned in the chest of the neighborhood, windows like blind, rectangular eyes. Somewhere near the rear, under a sagging fire escape, the sounds came from the mouth of a loading bay. The huge roll-up door hung half open, the metal lips snagging the night air. As we drew closer, I saw shapes inside the bay. A tangle of pallets, a rusted conveyor belt, and leaning against a pillar, impossibly out of place, a child's wooden rocking horse with one ear chewed. The sight made my stomach lurch. It felt like a prop dropped into a crime scene. Then we saw the footprints. They tracked away from the door's mouth along the muddy floor, a trail of heavy-soled prints dusted with a pale ash that shimmered in our flashlight beams. The ash smelled like nothing human, neither smoke nor salt, but a scent like cold iron and rain. Mason crouched, running a finger along the edge of one print. "Not all that old," he said. "Fresh." I remember the wave of heat that hit me, a tremor like a sob that I tried to swallow. Someone, or something, had been here recently. Not artists, not squatters. We pushed into the cavernous dark, the flashlight pools, tiny islands. The echo of our steps multiplied into a small army of sounds. At the back, where the floor sloped toward a clogged drain, the air stank faintly of old chemicals and turned pages. On a table lay a scattering of possessions, a cracked watch, a faded baseball cap with the name Huntsman embroidered on it, and a folded drawing, a child's sketch of a house under an enormous crescent moon, the moon painted with too many teeth. I realized how vulnerable we were. Two grown men, a wooden horse, a child's scribble, and the whisper of an old factory. It felt obscene, like finding a photograph of someone you loved inside the fabric of a stranger's coat. I wanted to call the police, to tell them we'd stumbled on evidence of something. But what evidence? Footprints in ash? A rocking horse? The impulse to turn the ordinary into proof is a human reflex. Sometimes proof arrives only after you refuse to leave. We heard a sound then, a low, keening whine that came from behind a stack of pallets. It could have been wind, the building's bones settling, or the vocalization of something alive. Mason made a move. We rounded the pallets together. There, propped against the cold brick, stood a door we hadn't seen before. A small steel service door with hinges eaten by rust. A faint smear of something dark tracked like a handprint across it. Mason reached for the handle and hesitated. "Jacob," he said, tone small. "Maybe we should wait." I felt a prickle at the base of my skull, the kind that feels like someone's watching from just outside the light. My rational head lined up reasons to leave. My body, stubborn and foolish, wanted answers. "We'll look, then leave," I said. The words were a contract. Inside the narrow service corridor beyond the door, the air was cooler, as if we'd stepped into a forgotten cellar. The hum underfoot returned, louder, like a distant machinery breathing. After 20 feet, the corridor opened into a chamber that smelled of mildew and antiseptic. Pale graffiti smeared the walls, odd marks that looked at once like tally marks and like small bones. In the center of the room, arrayed as if on an altar, lay dozens of photographs. Polaroids, their edges curled, faces staring up at us. Children mostly, and one or two adults, each photo crossed with a single black line. I remember a force in my chest like someone had pressed their palm there. I recognized two faces, neighbors. Elaine in a floral scarf, mid-smile, her roses blurred in the background. Someone else I knew from the coffee shop, a regular with a scar on his chin. My mouth went dry. These were neighbors. These were people we passed on porches. Before Mason could say anything, a sound piped through the darkness, very close, like someone whispering at the edge of hearing. It said a single name, my name, in a voice that was not a voice but a scraping of air, Jacob. The sound made my knees tremble. Mason grabbed my arm. He looked at me, eyes wide, and mouthed, "Run?" I heard Officer Holt's cruiser in the distance, the faintest siren, a sound that seemed absurdly small. Something moved in the corner of the room, a silhouette folding itself like a paper cutout. It wasn't human in proportion. Limbs too long, head tilted at a wrong angle. It stepped into our light and I saw its face. And in the same instant, all the stories I had grown up on, all the rational models I used to live my life, fractured like glass. The face had eyes that reflected nothing, two dull coins set in a mask of pale skin. Its mouth was closed, but as it turned, a thin metallic scent filled the chamber, the same as the ash in the footprints. It made a sound, neither a word nor a cry, but a scraping intonation like stress on a wended violin string. It moved toward us, not fast, but with absolute inevitability, as if it had rehearsed the approach 1,000 times in some back room. I can't explain why I did what I did next. Muscle memory, then terror, sharpened into motion. Mason yanked me back toward the corridor, the photos fluttering like trapped birds behind us. We squeezed through the narrow doorway and ran. Not for the cruiser, not for Officer Holt, but for my house 2 blocks away, past the maples, past the flickering light that had died at 9:25 and the one that had gone fully dark an hour later. We stumbled into my kitchen, sweating, panting, shaking in a way that could not be faked. We called the police then, finally, and told Officer Holt what we'd found. He took notes, eyes narrowing in the way of a man who's seen more trouble than he wants to think about. "Anybody else here tonight?" he asked. We told him about Lila, Elaine, about the children in the photos. He furrowed his brow, radioed in, and promised he'd send more units. The resolve in his voice gave me a small, ridiculous relief. But the relief was thin. That night, sleep dissolved into a thrumming worry. My apartment felt invaded, not by any physical presence, but by knowledge that something had crossed the line between the public and the private. I lay awake with the house settling around me, listening for the scrape that had announced itself under the factory's belly. For a while, nothing more happened than the city working through its nocturnal rituals. A distant train, a drunk shout, a siren fading. At 3:17 a.m., when the house felt the most vulnerable, my bedroom window rattled as if a hand had tapped the glass. I woke, breath condensed on cold air, and saw, or thought I saw, a shape outside by the maple tree. Not the bulky silhouette of a person, but something thinner, a shadow that moved with the wrong kind of grace, as if the night itself had walked up to my window and looked in. I flung the curtain aside. Nothing. The street was empty. The maple stood like a sentinel, leaves rustling. The window had a single smear, like a fingertip dragged across the pane. In the smear was a trace of the same pale ash I'd seen in the factory. I wasn't safe. Mason wasn't safe. The neighborhood wasn't safe in any practical sense that anyone compares. We had stumbled into something deliberate and ancient feeling, something that kept records of people and of nights. We had been noticed. When morning came, the city moved on. Trash trucks hummed, coffee brewed, and Lila opened her shop with a smile that did not reach behind her eyes. But the photographs existed. The footprints existed. The smear existed. And somewhere in the Franklin & Sons building, something was keeping a ledger of our lives. That day, a flurry of police cars arrived, more than I had imagined would come for a couple of men's frightened report. They sealed off the building, officers in vests moving like slow predators. I watched from my porch as they hauled tarps and cameras into the mouth of the loading bay. Officer Holt took my statement twice, then again, as if repetition might make the narrative clearer. I thought, naively, that with the police there, whatever had been in that factory would be contained, explained, logged away. Instead, containment felt like a temporary bandage on a deeper wound. The photos that had been taken from the chamber would become evidence, cataloged and cataloged again. Reporters would sniff the air 2 days from now and find nothing sensational enough to run on the front page. And yet, the scrape had a rhythm, and a voice had said my name in a way I could not unhear. That night, as the sun set and the city folded into itself, the empty places in me contracted. I was not the same man who folded shirts with precise hands. The world had revealed a seam. Whatever lived in it had slipped a thread free. The terror wasn't only in the factory or the photos. It was in being marked and knowing it. Mason stood by my kitchen window that evening with coffee cooling in his hands. He didn't have a plan, and neither did I. We only had the knowledge that something had started to pay attention, and that attention might very well circle back to us. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The city tried to convince itself everything would be normal. Reporters sniffed around the yellow tape for a morning, and then trotted off to fresher scandals. The police kept the Franklin & Sons lot cordoned and posted a sign that read, "No trespassing," as if legalese alone could hold darkness at bay. But the thing about terror is it doesn't respect schedules. It ignores the way humans catalog days into neat little boxes. It simply keeps going. After the photos were taken as evidence and cataloged, some of the faces were identified, not all at once, but in a severity that made the stomach drop. Elaine's photo was confirmed. She'd been to the post office 2 days earlier to mail a package and wasn't seen after sundown the evening before. A father from church, Pastor Whitcomb, missed Sunday service. A teenage neighbor, Aaron Vale, didn't show up for his morning shift at the bakery. The list grew in small, bureaucratic increments until the city paper printed a thin column about unexplained absences, and the mayor made an oblique promise that kept everyone awake at night. Officer Holt came by my place more than once those first few days. He was calmer in daylight, hands steady, eyes scanning like a man assembling furniture with an instruction manual. He asked questions I'd already answered and listened as if some new configuration of facts might make sense if arranged properly. "Anything else happen?" he'd ask. I told him about the window smear, about waking at 3:17, and the way my name had been spoken inside that chamber. He wrote in his book, thumbed a pen, and said, "We're doing everything we can." The phrase felt less like reassurance and more like a ritual word to keep panic from boiling over into hysteria. Lila closed her coffee shop for 2 days. When she reopened, she moved the counter like a face pressed against a coin. She wouldn't make eye contact for long, and when she did, there was a tremor in her voice. "People are scared," she said, loading a cup with too much foam. "Even the cats have been acting strange." She told me she'd seen a man slipping out from the alley behind the shop at dawn, hood up, carrying a small packet wrapped in old newspaper. She had followed him for half a block and lost him under the old elm. Lila never liked to dwell on the sinister. She fixed things with gentle coffee, but even she admitted to a shiver now and then in the quiet after closing. Rumors began to kink through the neighborhood like a slow drip. Some claimed to have seen a figure at the edge of the river, long-limbed and hunched, drinking from the water, as if sipping a soup. Others spoke of lights in the Franklin and Sons windows at odd hours, of a glow like candlelight in rooms long boarded up. Theo, the city maintenance foreman, scoured structural reports and utility logs. He found nothing electrical that could explain the hum we'd all felt. "Old pipes," he said at first. Then, after nights of staring at blueprints, he changed his tone. "There's been activity in the sublevels for years. We thought trespassers, but it's more organized than that." He tapped a page with his forefinger. On it were scrawled symbols that looked nothing like the neat municipal type he usually dealt with, marks that echoed the graffiti we'd seen in the corridor. The absence of straightforward answers tightened its grip. I'd walk down Easton Street and count the faces in windows like someone checking attendance. Mason, who had always been braver in the face of the unknown, started to flinch at sudden noises and refused to stay out late. One night he admitted to me, voice small in the kitchen, "I dream there are lines being drawn across my hands, like tally marks." He'd been careful to joke about it, but that night, the joke failed. Investigations produced fragments. The Polaroids were stamped and digitized. Some matched missing persons reports, others did not. For a time, the police refused to call the pattern a serial abduction. It's a bureaucratic thing. Classifications are cages, and once you name a thing, you must allocate resources, declare emergency, admit failure. The city was not ready to say its failure out loud. And besides, how do you convince a jurisdiction that someone, something, was keeping a ledger of people with black lines across their faces? On the fourth night after the discovery, the ledger found me. I was sifting through my emails at midnight, trying, in a ritual of denial, to return to numbers and reports, when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. No message, just a photo. I didn't open it at once. My thumb hovered like a man over a red switch. When I finally tapped, the image swallowed the screen. A small square, grainy, Polaroid style. My stomach fell through me. It was a photograph of my own house taken from the street, taken at night. There was a smear on the front window. A date had been handwritten on the white border, 3 nights from now. And, under the date, a single word, Jacob. My hands went cold. I called Mason, who answered in 3 rings, voice like gravel. "You got the same?" I asked. He was quiet. Mine said the same, the numbers unknown. We sat and listened to each other breathing across the wires. "We can go back to the factory with Theo," Mason said finally. "Get inside with evidence, police present, force a confrontation." It was exactly the sort of plan that is comfortable until you start to imagine what you do when the inevitable happened. But the ledger did what a ledger does. It kept accounts. And my name was written at the top of the page with the phrase, 3 nights from now. It didn't announce when it would take, only that it had marked a moment. That felt worse than a threat. Threats are promises. A ledger is inevitability. We planned for the next night. Officer Holt was wary, but agreed to coordinate a small team to escort us into the building's outer areas. Public safety, he said. Public curiosity, I thought. Theo brought bolt cutters and a portable generator. Lila insisted on coming, though I tried to dissuade her. "You're the neighborhood," she said, folding her hands. "We can't pretend this is someone else's problem." Her eyes, when she said it, were not businesslike. They were raw and tired. She left her coffee shop's keys on my counter like a small oath. When we approached Franklin and Sons that night, the air had the same briny iron scent as before. The police lights made everything look falsely clinical, blue and red bleeding across broken glass and rusted metal. We moved in a small group, 2 flashlights cutting white paths through the dark. The yawning roll-up door hunched like a jaw. Inside, the soundscape of the factory seemed to have a memory. The hum under the floor was present, as if some slow motor ticked with the patience of a clock. We went back to the service corridor, the place where the photographs had been arrayed. The room was dustier this time. The evidence tent had been set up and then inexplicably removed. A few photos remained, pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. Others were gone. The Polaroids that were left had fresh black marks drawn across them, like the ones we'd seen earlier, but this time the marks were accompanied by small circles and dates in a hand I didn't recognize. At the center of the room, on a low table, sat a book. It was bound in rough leather and had no title. When I opened it, my breath hitched. Inside was a list of names, written in cramped, efficient script. Dates and small annotations filled the margins. Names I recognized, underlined. Names I didn't, crossed out. And at the very bottom of the page, in a hand that was steadier and more deliberate than any of the other annotations, was today's date and my name again. Beside it, in slightly redder ink, was written, "Accounted, 72 hours." I felt the world tilt. The book was a ledger in the most literal sense, not just of faces in photographs, but a chronological account of those taken. Someone, something, had been keeping records longer than our neighborhood existed. The thought of being not an anomaly, but an entry, a ticked-off thing in someone else's bookkeeping, made my throat close. A noise then, from deeper in the complex, the familiar scrape, slow and patient, like a fingernail across metal. Our flashlights caught movement, something slipping between columns like a piece of cloth. Theo moved forward, voice steady in a way men try to be when insisting on courage. "Hands up if you're trespassing," he called. No human voice answered. Instead, a whisper came from behind the walls, a chorus of names frayed and layered like old wiring. "Jacob," the chorus breathed. Not a voice, but a rustling of paper and bone. Something brushed my shoulder like a long, cold finger. I spun, but saw only a shadow folding into the darkness. On the wall, where our flashlight beam hit, fresh ash had been smeared into tally marks. Not 6, not 7, but a large cluster of them, like the counting of long years. Mason grabbed my arm, and the three of us ran out of the corridor, through the cavernous space where the rocking horse had waited, up the riverwalk, past the silent cruiser, and all the way to my porch. We slammed the door, locked it, and for a long time none of us spoke. The ledger existed. The sounds in the building were not random. The time on the ledger meant something. Outside, the neighborhood continued its small rituals. A car alarm, distant laughter. Inside, the air tasted like old paper. I placed the photo that had been sent to my phone face down on the kitchen table. It was only then that I noticed a new smear across the glossy border, almost invisible, not ash, but a thin residue like dried glue. In the center, pressed faintly into the residue, was an imprint, a small circle, perhaps the size of a fingertip. It was a mark that had been left like a signature. 3 nights, 72 hours. The ledger had issued a due date. We had a choice, to wait and hope that the ledger was a bluff, or to fight against the counting. The choice felt less like a moral decision and more like a sacrament. To act, or to be acted upon. Mason's voice broke the silence. "We don't have to do this alone," he said. "We can bring people. We can bring everyone. Force it into the light." I thought of the photographs with their black crosses, of Elaine's absence, of Pastor Whitcomb's empty pew. I thought of the ledger's quiet certainty. I thought of the handprint on my window and the way my name had been spoken in a croak that matched neither living nor dead. The counting kept moving, an indifferent clock. The night outside our houses pressed close. Inside, the ledger ticked. I slept in fits that night, waking to check the phone, the window, the sounds in the walls. Each time I blinked, the 72 hours shrank. When dawn stole over Willowbend, it felt less like hope and more like a brief reprieve. We had a plan of sorts. Not heroics, not finality, only a list of names, a book of dates, and a stubborn refusal to be reduced to an entry. The ledger would have to be met. 3 nights remained. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We gathered at dusk, the 72 hours a few breaths away from closing. Word had spread like a rumor with legs. Lila had handed out flyers at the shop. Reverend Holden sent an email thread to the congregation. Theo rallied a few of his crew, and Officer Holt demanded a proper plan. Not heroics, but procedure. People showed up with flashlights, with cameras, with baseball bats and espresso thermoses. Faces that had been in the Polaroids clustered together under the porch lights. Neighbors, baristas, mail carriers, a teacher from the elementary school. Fear had a way of making company. When you look at a list of names and realize yours sits at the bottom, you find you prefer not to be alone. We met at my kitchen table and spread the ledger's copy on newspapers. The book itself had remained at the evidence locker. The police had been strange about letting civilians touch it, but Theo had photographed every page with the patience of a man cataloging storm damage. We taped those photos to a large piece of plywood and planned around them. The plan was not cunning, it was earnest and blunt. Light, numbers, witnesses. If whatever kept its ledger fed on privacy, on silence, then we would make noise. If it kept accounts through photographs and secret rooms, then we'd bring cameras, recorders, people. We hoped that the ledger could not bear the weight of witnesses. Once we walk in, Officer Holt said, we stay together. No splitting up. If anything happens, we fall back to the light and the people. His voice carried the impossible steadiness I'd come to trust. We marched down Willow Bend like a small army of civilians and one official. The Franklin & Sons lot was quieter than the night we'd first gone in. All the casual terror of the intervening days had settled into a tight, anticipatory silence. We had lights. Lots of them. And a generator Theo had dragged from a municipal shed. We placed flood lamps along the river walk and set up cameras to face the service corridor. Lila brought her old Polaroid camera and refused to leave it at the edge of the group. At the threshold of the roll-up door, a hush fell. For a second, I was back at my kitchen table, an ordinary man counting the hours on his fingers, and I realized how small all my normal defenses had been. Then we moved. The corridor smelled of damp, of old paper and machine oil. The hum was present, but muted by all the city noise we'd aimed at it. We pressed forward as one thing, flashlights making a swarm of white in the dark. The photographs on the wall were still there, pinned like butterflies beneath glassless frames. The Polaroids glared back at us. I had faces crossed in black ink. Then the ledger itself. The book lay on the same low table where we'd seen it, as if it had been waiting. When I opened it, and I did, because a ledger is a ledger and the spine gives way to the world inside, a stack of pages fluttered like birds. Names written in small, precise handwriting, margins filled with notations, accounted, delayed, transferred. But as we watched, one line near the middle of the book began to move. I don't mean the ink rearranged itself like words on a telegram. The letters shifted, ink lifting and darkening as though someone else were writing with a pen dipped in night. A name formed, Mason Boone. Below it, the notation began to crawl across the page. Offered. Retained. Mason, who had been steady and loud all night, went white. He reached out with a hand that trembled and slapped his palm down on the page. No, he said, so small that it might have been swallowed by the walls. Something answered then, a sound that was equal parts paper rustle and a human whisper, and it walked the length of the room. The lights wavered, not as if the electricity failed, but as if a hand had dragged its fingers along the sky. Shadows lengthened and slid like tide water. From between two columns, the figure stepped. Thin, two long limbs folded beneath a jacket of darkness, a face with no features I could name, but which registered as memory in the back of my skull, the shape of a ledger's corner, the thinness of a tally mark. It spoke, and the voice came like leaves dragged through a gutter. You turned a page, it said. You read what keeps the hours. Names are nodes to me, I tally. I remember. Why? Lila asked. She had the Polaroid camera clutched like a rosary. Her voice shook, but there was a steel behind it. Why the photographs? Why the ledger? A laugh, soft as a coin, spun on concrete. Because when they are counted, they are carried, the thing said. When I write their names, they cross. I am record and ferry. I ease the passage. We wanted to bargain with the grammar of that, to say a ledger is a thing with ink and paper, but Mason moved then, and his movement decided the night. He stepped forward, hands up, not as a threat, but as an offering. Take me, he said. Take me instead. Take me and be done. I remember yelling. I remember grabbing at him, the wood of the ledger warm and the edges of the table digging into my palms. Mason's face was untroubled, not in panic, but in some small, luminous resolve. I promised I'd keep you safe, Jake, he said. I'm not going to fail at that. He stepped closer to the shadow until it wrapped around him like a coat. The figure moved like smoke, finding a chimney. It touched Mason's shoulder with a finger that felt like cold paper. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. I tried to scream to Theo, to Holt, to anyone, but sound tangled in my throat. Mason's eyes met mine. There was no fear there, only a softness, as if he'd found a place where the day's small cruelties could be repaired with one big, stubborn decision. The ledger's ink bled a little then, and Mason's name in the book smudged as if the page were wet. He smiled, an awful, beautiful thing, and then the shadow drew him in, and he was gone. There was a ripping sound like a page being torn out. For a second, I felt the ledger's weight leave the world, and then a physical ache like a missing tooth. Lila screamed, a raw animal sound. A dozen people surged forward, lights flashed and cameras recorded, and among it all the shadow receded into the dark with an almost bored air. It had taken one thing and left the ledger open and flipping on its own, windless. Officer Holt ran to the table, hands fumbling for the book. He tried to close it, to staple it, to do something bureaucratic and neat, to fix what had happened. But the ledger would not be fixed. The spine had less hold now that a name had been given. On the table where Mason had stood lay his phone, his handkerchief, a smear of ash like a fingerprint. The photograph that had been on my phone, the one with my window marked, fluttered by the breeze and landed on the floor, face down. We found in the following hours and days the ledger with Mason's name erased from its pages and a new emptiness where it had been. We found weeks later a note pinned to Theo's bulletin board, a scrap of paper with Mason's handwriting, folded and dry. "If I counted for you," it read in small letters, "then count me willingly." No one could say whether he had been taken, or had gone, or had been carried somewhere between the ledger's lines. What happened afterward was not the clean victory I had wanted. But the ledger's techniques, its tallying and carrying, had ceased in our neighborhood for a long time. People returned from absences. Some came back with stories that watered down into salmon-colored nonsense at the edges. Dreams of staircases, a scent of burnt sugar, a memory of hands that smelled like old books. Elaine was found 3 weeks later, wandering near the river, able to say only that she had been on a long walk and had been let go. Pastor Whitcomb returned to the pulpit with his voice shrunken but intact. Aaron came back to the bakery the next fall as if he'd been late only briefly. Lila said months later that the cats stopped slinking by the Franklin and Sons lot. And yet, my house still bore that faint smear on the window for years after, a pale circle I would scrub with everything from ammonia to vinegar, and it never left entirely. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and the maple's leaves pooled at the curb like congregants, I would wake and think I heard the soft flip of pages through the walls. I would dream of Mason smiling and of a ledger that counted whoever looked back at it. I would lay a hand on the small scar on my palm where his fingernail had caught me the night he stepped forward, and I would feel the press of a letter's ink in my bones. We had not defeated whatever had made its book and its rules. We had learned that ledgered things could be bargained with, sometimes paid with a life. We had learned the strange currency of attention, that when enough eyes are trained on paper and darkness, the dark can be forced to yield, sometimes to release, sometimes to take. Mason paid a kind of grace into our account. His name was no longer a line on a page. It was a hollow in our days, a memory with weight. I am a man who likes spreadsheets, like columns where every cell can be accounted for. That kind of order is a comfort, and yet all the comfort in the world could not explain the ledger or the way a name can be both protection and invitation. I live believing that the ledger still exists somewhere with its neat script and its patient habit of counting. I live with the knowledge that some things are kept because someone or something insists on remembering. If you walk by the Franklin and Sons lot on a rainy night, keep a light on in your house. If you receive a photograph of your home with a date scrawled on its edge, put it under glass and show someone else. And if a friend steps forward as Mason did, hold their hand with the fierce tenderness of the living. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.